Explain your position on moral realism.
I think it's analogous to mathematics. Mathematical facts aren't facts about the universe. They are, in some sense, true all the way throughout the universe.
What's your view on God?
I think God exists. My credence in Christianity is like 10%.
What about P Judaism?
2 or 3.
What about P Mormonism?
0.6% or something.
What exactly am I accepting here?
A perfect being of limitless power, knowledge, and goodness who made the world.
Welcome to Doom Debates. Today my guest is Matthew Adelstein, known as Bentham's Bulldog on Substack. He has over 4,000 subscribers, including Nate Silver, Sam Harris, and Scott Alexander, who's described it as one of his favorites. He's an undergraduate philosophy major at the University of Michigan, currently studying abroad in Oxford, and he's already published 3 philosophy papers in academic journals. I'm excited to talk to Matthew because he has various interesting disagreements with Eliezer Yudkowsky's less wrong sequences, so I want to explore where he gets off the quote-unquote rationality train. And then we'll talk about how our rationality debate affects the AI doom debate. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
All right, so to prepare for the show, I've been reading your articles, and I gotta say, you're clearly a very smart guy, very great writer, and yet you diverge from the less wrong canon. So how do you think that you and Eliezer have drifted so far apart?
Well, I don't think it's that surprising. If you look at most people who are smart and good writers, the vast majority of them are not that much in agreement with Eliezer Yudkowsky. Now, this isn't mark against Eliezer. Just most smart people have fairly unique ideologies, and they tend to not agree on a huge amount. So I don't think it's that surprising that I've diverged from Eliezer. I will say, so when I was in high school, which was around when I started the blog, I was in agreement with a lot of the things that Eliezer said, and over time, I started being in agreement with the things that Eliezer said less. I sort of reflected on on various issues, and I came to conclude that many of the things that Eliezer says, particularly about philosophy, which is something that I know a thing or two about, are implausible.
I see. So you're saying there's a kind of orthogonality thesis in philosophical viewpoints where not every smart person converges to Eliezer.
Yes, this is correct. I mean, I think, there are lots of smart people in the world who do not follow the less wrong sequences.
That's an interesting hypothesis. I'll have to think about that one. Okay, so zooming out, how would you describe your Substack and your research? Do you have a particular long-term focus area?
So the things I write about, I write about a variety of things. Most of them are related to philosophy. Some of them are about philosophy of religion. Some of them are about anthropic reasoning, where anthropic reasoning is how to do probabilistic reasoning about the fact of your own existence. So like the sweeping beauty problem, if those in the audience may have heard of, is an example of a puzzle in anthropic reasoning. I also just write about various sort of, culture war-y topics. And then one thing I do a lot is I write in defense of effective altruism. Despite my disagreements with the less wrong canon, I'm very much in agreement with effective altruism, and I find there to be lots of extremely lame criticisms that are constantly churned out by journalists or by critics who are, I think, making bad arguments. And so I think those arguments I like, writing rebuttals to, and writing in defense of effective altruism. So overall, it's sort of a mix of whatever I happen to be thinking about at the time. A lot of the time that's related to philosophy, a lot of the time that's related to effective altruism, and then a lot of the time it's not related to any of those things, and it's just sort of some things that I've been thinking about.
Awesome. You and I are very much on the same page about how great effective altruism is, so we're not going to be spending a lot of time today debating that. But for the audience, I do have another guest coming on soon where he doesn't like effective altruism, so you can look forward to that one.
Yeah, this is the Doom Debates podcast, not the Doom Circle Jerk podcast.
Exactly right. You said you've written 3 philosophy papers. What are those about?
Okay, so the first one was about the different normative ethical views approach to how we treat animals. The basic takeaway is no matter what your normative ethical view is, the way that we treat animals is very bad. Whether you're a utilitarian, whether you're a deontologist, the fact that we lock hundreds of billions of trillions if you count sea creatures and tens of billions of land animals in these tiny torturous factory farms where they spend their entire life having these short lives of intense suffering. On any plausible ethical view, that's bad. So I wrote a little bit about the history of the different ethical views. The other two papers I have, one of them is called Alternatives to the Self-Indication Assumption Are Doomed. So there is a view of anthropic reasoning known as the self-indication assumption. And what the self-indication assumption says is that you should treat your existence as giving a theory an update by a factor of n, where n is the number of times more people that you might presently be on that theory. That's a little abstract. Let me give a concrete example. Suppose that a coin gets flipped, and if it comes up heads, one person gets created, and if it comes up tails, 10 people get created. The self-indication assumption says that upon being created, you should think that tails is 10 times likelier than heads, because the idea is that on tails, there are 10 times as many people created, so it's 10 times as likely that you would be created. So that's a self-indication assumption. What I argued in that paper was that any view that follows Bayesian conditionalization and diverges from the self-indication assumption has really absurd implications. Okay, so that's the second paper. The third paper, I was arguing against antinatalism, essentially. Well, more specifically, I was arguing against one particular antinatalist argument, where what lots of antinatalists say is they say that having a child who lives a good life, that isn't a good thing. It's good to make existing people better off, but there's nothing valuable about creating a person just because they live a happy life. And I argued that this is wrong. I gave 3 plausible principles, and so long as you think that each of these 3 principles is right, then you end up getting the result that there is a reason to create a person just because they would live a good life. It's good to have a child who lives a happy life. It's not merely good to make existing people better off.
Nice. Okay, so that's somewhat diverse, 3 pretty diverse topics. Publishing 3 papers and writing a popular philosophy blog as a roughly 20-year-old, that's pretty rare. How did you grow up to be this way?
So I don't know if I have super informative things to say about my childhood and how it caused me to do this. I mean, I guess the thing that's relevant to the story is around the age of 16, I got really interested in philosophy because I got into a long debate with a friend of mine about whether morality was objective. And so I started reading a large amount about philosophy as a result of that dispute. And I came to, and then, this led to me reading and thinking more about philosophy. And then I guess the other thing that's relevant is, I started the blog when I was, I think, 18 or 17, just because I read an article by Michael Huemer criticizing utilitarianism, and I disagreed with it, but I thought many of the responses that other people were giving were kind of lame. So I decided, I want to write a good response, and it ended up becoming a 10-part series, and I learned that, blogging is a really fun thing to do. So I decided that I'd do it more.
What philosophical schools, movements, or other intellectual traditions do you consider yourself part of?
So, I mean, that's a hard question to answer because I think if you ask like a modern philosopher what philosophical school they're part of, generally it won't be as well defined as with like ancient philosophers. You can sort them nicely into movements. With modern philosophers, usually they'll just have a cluster of views, and the views won't fit nicely into some specific movement. So I guess one movement, quote unquote, is that the kind of philosophy that I do and think is much more serious is analytic philosophy, where there's analytic philosophy and there's continental philosophy. Analytic philosophy stresses to a much greater degree clarity in writing, giving specific arguments, numbering your premises. When you read a continental philosopher, like, for example, Hegel, you'll sort of get a vague sense of the things that they're saying, but you won't be able to put it precisely into an argument. You won't know, if you try to figure out how many premises Hegel's argument had, you get a large number of different answers. With an analytic philosopher, they'll tend to be clear, and you won't be completely in the dark about what kinds of arguments they're making. So
makes sense. So a modern philosopher such as yourself, you might opine on 10 different topics, and you just take different positions on these 10 different topics. Is there any kind of clustering that happens where you can say, well, I'm kind of in this region of opinions?
So there certainly is some clustering. like the sorts of things you think about one subject will definitely influence the kinds of things that you think about other subjects. So, for example, if you end up thinking, say, that morality, you can give this naturalistic reduction of moral facts and this naturalistic reduction of mathematical facts, then probably you'll think the same thing about, say, modal facts, where modal facts are facts about what's possible and necessary. In contrast, if you think the mathematical facts don't reduce to facts about the physical world, if you think that the moral facts don't reduce to facts about the physical world, then you'll probably be more doubtful that the modal facts reduce to facts about the physical world, or that the logical facts and so on. So I guess in that sense, I'm kind of a non-reductionist, where there's an axis from thinking that lots and lots of things just reduce to the physical world and or are not real, versus thinking that no, lots of things are real, and I fall more on the direction of thinking these things are real and don't reduce to the physical world. This is true of morality. This is true, I think, of math, though that's not a subject I've looked into as closely and don't have particularly interesting things to say about. And it's true of, say, the modal facts, which are facts about as I said, about what's possible and necessary. I'm also a theist, so I guess that's one one thing I think exists that is not the natural world. God.
Right. Okay. Wow. A non-reductionist and a theist. So I rarely have people in my circles who are non-reductionists and theists. So that's why I thought it would be so interesting for us to discuss and see if we can productively hash out that disagreement. So we'll get into that soon. Let me just touch on animal welfare, because that's such a running theme throughout your posts. And I said I basically agree with you on effective altruism. I think I basically agree with you on animal welfare. So if I remember correctly, your basic argument about animal welfare is there's so many animals, and it does seem like we make them suffer in factory farms quite a lot, right? So out of everything that humanity does, your argument is basically that this is like by far the worst moral stain, and we should be like hyper-focused on improving it, correct?
That's right. Now, it ends up being hard to figure out what the worst thing we're doing is when you take into account wild animals, because there are just so many wild animals that it might be that our actions' effects on wild animals are even greater than our actions' effects on factory farming. But certainly the actions that we take that harm humans, I think, are much less bad in terms of the total amount of wrongdoing than the actions that we do that harm animals. So I think, for example, that factory farming is worse than any atrocity that's ever been committed against humans. And this may sound like an extremely surprising claim, right? That factory farming is worse than, whatever atrocity you can think of. But, well, so every year we torture and kill about 90 billion animals, maybe like 70 billion, somewhere between around 70 billion and 90 billion. This is only counting the land animals. If you count the sea creatures, it's way more than that. They often live their entire lives are these short lives of extremely intense suffering. So they'll live in these tiny, filthy cages where they can't turn around, where they're standing on wire meshing all the time, where they're genetically engineered to be enormous and to weigh a huge amount, so they can't move properly, and so they're like just lying against acidic feces all day. Taking into account that at any given moment, about 24 billion land animals are in factory farms in conditions that no one would hesitate to call torture if inflicted on a dog or a human, the quantity of suffering that factory farming causes every few years is almost certainly more than all the suffering that has ever existed in all of human history. Taking that into account, when you realize that factory farming causes more suffering than has existed in all human history every few years, then it stops seeming that implausible that it's the worst thing in the world. So long as you think that suffering is bad, which I think any plausible view will hold that suffering is bad, if we inflict more suffering than has existed in all of human history over the course of just a few years, that ends up being pretty bad. Remember, over the course in 2 years, factory farms slaughter about more than the population of all humans that have ever lived. It's about 80 billion a year, when with humans, only about 110 billion humans have ever lived. So when you realize we're basically, we have the industrial scale torture machines that consign every 2 years creatures to a life of horrendous suffering and misery, where that every 2 years about as many creatures die from this as humans have ever lived, then it stops seeming so counterintuitive that this might be the worst thing in the world. If you think that animal suffering isn't morally serious, then maybe you might think that. but it's hard to see on what grounds animal suffering would be significantly less morally serious than human suffering. If we think about what it's like to suffer, the badness of a person suffering doesn't seem to depend on how smart they are. It doesn't seem to depend on whether they can do calculus. It seems to depend on what it feels like to suffer. Now, animals can feel suffering just as we can. Maybe they don't feel it exactly as intensely as we do, but they feel it with a decent degree of intensity, certainly. Particularly the land animals that we factory farm that are fairly similar to us. So given this, unless you have some, in my view, completely indefensible view that explains why their suffering isn't bad at all, then I think that factory farming being one of the worst things in the world just comes out almost trivially. Yeah.
Great. Okay, so everything you just said about animal welfare, I agree, and I encourage listeners, go to benthams.substack.com, read the stuff on animal welfare, because I completely agree. I think it's very well written, makes a very strong case. Let's try to improve animal welfare. And the rest of the topics that I have, I feel like I disagree with you on them so much. So it's nice to get the agreement stuff out of the way.
Yeah.
Okay. So before we get into the juicy meat that is God and some of these other topics, consciousness, let's talk about reductionism. So I'm fascinated that you're telling me that you're a non-reductionist. What do you think reductionism means?
It is hard to provide any particularly interesting definition of any philosophically contentious term. But I think there's a spectrum of how many things you want to build into the fundamental framework of reality versus how many things you want to say are wholly explained by the simpler things, right? So now everyone agrees that, for example, life is not fundamental. If life can be explained just as you don't need some mysterious substance, some élan vital to get life. All you need is cells that function in the right way in order to get life.
Mm-hmm.
So I think the people who are reductionists think that a similar picture to the one you get for life or for fire, where basically once we understand the natural world better, we'll get an explanation of them. I think these people fall more on the reductionist side versus other people who think that there are some things where you're not going to find a good explanation of them, and these things will just have to be fundamental. So in particular, I think consciousness is that way. I think that the moral facts are not. I think the moral facts are both objective and are not facts about the natural world. The fact that, say, it's wrong to torture babies is not a description of like how the natural world behaves. It's not the sort of thing that you could find from a test tube. So in that sense, I fall more on the non-reductionist side, in that I think there are a lot of different things that we're not going to be able to get a nice reduction of, and we're just going to have to build in fundamental.
Great. Okay, yeah, let me unpack that a little bit. So I think pretty much everybody is a reductionist about cars. Nobody's like, oh yeah, the engine of my car works because of engine spirits. It's like, what? Like humans just put it together in a factory, like we understood every part. So everybody's a reductionist about cars. When you were explaining reductionism, you kind of made it seem like everybody today is a reductionist about biological life, correct?
That's right.
And that didn't used to be the case, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so and there probably are still people today who think the fact that bacteria and plants and animals are so lively means that they probably have like an ontologically fundamental soul, right? So that's still a position that some people hold, right?
Yeah.
Okay, but you and I are both like, yeah, that's dumb. Like everybody should be reductionist about biological life.
Yeah.
Okay. So the difference between me and you is that you get off the reductionism train when it comes to what, the creation of the universe?
Well, I can think of so I mean, I guess nobody's going to think that whatever the first thing is reduces, right? So suppose you're a naturalist and you think that that the universe is like infinitely old or something. Well, clearly, whatever it is that ultimately explains why things exist, that's not going to reduce to anything fundamental. By definition, if it's the thing that explains the other stuff, it can't reduce. But so I guess that one doesn't seem like that's not quite a reductionism. Like talking about whether God exists, that's a little bit orthogonal to the reductionism dispute. Both theists and atheists agree that there's something that doesn't reduce. The theists think it's God. The atheists think that it is the natural world or some initial state of the natural world or something like that. There's actually a sense in which I'm more reductionist than you, because I think that all of the natural world reduces to the actions carried out by an agent. Of course, then I think that
nice
is
try, nice
interpretive,
try.
but-
Eliezer Yudkowsky has a definition of reductionism that I like to use. I think it's a productive definition, which is um, reductionists just don't believe in ontologically fundamental mental entities. So if they're entities that have a simple mathematical character, then they count as reductionism. If they're fundamental to your ontology and yet they're mental or conscious or fancy in that way, then you're not a reductionist. And I very much am a reductionist, as is most of the people I know who I think have good opinions on AI Duve and AI in general. And just like, I'm very much steeped in this reductionism. Whereas, just to clarify what you're saying, you are not a reductionist in that sense because you think that you just can't reduce some fundamental mental thing that created the universe.
Well, that's not the only thing I think you can't reduce.
Okay.
I don't think you can. I mean, I don't think God will reduce to anything more fundamental. I don't agree with Eliezer's definition because there are lots of things that you might be a reductionist about that are not mental, right? So, for example, I would say that if a person thinks that, say, bacteria don't reduce, and that basically you need a special sauce in order to get bacteria that doesn't reduce, I would say that those people are non-reductionists. Now, in that case,
Well,
bacteria
but
are
what if the
non-mental.
special sauce is just like another quantum particle? Isn't that still reductionist?
Well, if you think that the ingredients that are needed to get bacteria are not bits of the natural world, but are not things that require a mind, right? So you might think like in order to get bacteria, like imagine you think bacteria are this fundamental irreducible substance that might be built into the groundwork of the world, or that might have been brought about by God. I would classify a person who thinks that as a non-reductionist about bacteria, and that they don't think that bacteria is explained by the workings of simpler things. But of course, bacteria isn't stuff that has a mind. Similarly, I think if a person thinks that mathematics, if they're a mathematical Platonist, they think mathematics is, there are objective mathematical facts that don't reduce to anything about the physical world, or they think that about moral facts. In this case, they don't believe in anything mental, but nonetheless,
let me try to explore your distinction here a little bit, okay? What if there's somebody who works in particle physics and that person says, I think there's another particle that is needed to explain things. Are they not reductionist?
So when you say explain things, what are
Explain things like explain forces. Like once we get another particle, it's going to explain forces better. Is that person reductionist?
I mean, I guess I think so. That person, I think, would be a reductionist writ large. So I guess it would be reasonable if there's a disagreement about that particular particle, whether it is explained by other stuff or whether that particle is just built in fundamentally. Then I would say they're non-reductionist about that particle. If you had a dispute between a physicist who thinks that X is fundamental and another one who thinks that X reduces, I'd say that the one who thinks that X is fundamental is a non-reductionist relative to the other physicists. They're a non-reductionist about X in that they think X doesn't reduce.
Well, what about the times when let's say we have a lot of Newtonian physicists, and then Einstein says Newtonian gravity is actually a phenomenon that reduces to the curvature of space-time, and somebody was like, no, Einstein's wrong. Newtonian physics is good as is. I don't know what Einstein's talking about. Is that other physicist who's not on board with Einsteinian physics yet, would you call them non-reductionist?
No, if you think that everything reduces to the stuff of the natural world, then I think you're a reductionist. Now, What I'm saying is that if you disagree about whether some particular thing is a fundamental feature of the natural world or whether it's explained by other features of the natural world, then I think in that case, you'd be disagreeing about reductionism about that thing, but you might still both be reductionists writ large.
It sounds like you're potentially sneaking in some complexity when you say what's the natural world versus what's not the natural world. So I didn't have to appeal to the natural world as a concept in my definition. I appealed to whether or not somebody has ontologically fundamental mental entities.
Right, but I don't think that's an adequate definition of reductionism. We don't have to talk about the definitions, but I'll just say if you think that morality is fundamental, you're a non-reductionist about morality. But you don't think that morality necessarily is the byproduct of a mind. I certainly don't think that. Nor might you think that the mathematical facts are the byproduct of a mind. So a person who thinks that, it seems like on your definition, you would classify them as a reductionist, so long as they think that there are no fundamentally mental entities. And to me, I don't think that captures the concept.
That's a good point. calculating a moral score, like let's say you say morality is outside the universe and there's some function, some ethereal function that calculates how moral things are, there's enough complexity in that calculation that it triggers my definition of mental when I talk about ontologically fundamental mental entities. So there's like an ontologically fundamental morality that doesn't reduce to like moving parts computing something within the universe. So I think I'd be willing to agree with you that that's non-reductionist. Is that fair?
Yeah, I agree. I agree that's non-reductionist. My claim is that thing's not mental. Right.
Yeah. Okay. Fair enough. I want to go back to something you said before. I thought it was an interesting example where you said a scientist who looks at a bacterium and says that there's a physical particle that makes the bacterium work. That that's kind of a level skipping example where normally we expect the operation of the bacterium or the operation of a car engine not to be directly explained by like the most fundamental physical laws, but rather to be to have layers of abstraction, layers of modularity, layers of engineering over and above the fundamental physical laws. And so somebody who wants to skip levels and say, no, the car engine and the bacterium work because there's a bacterium soul and there's a car engine soul. Even if that soul is a fundamental particle and even if it's non-mental, their taste for skipping levels is non-reductionist, correct?
Yeah, but I was just disagreeing about your definition where you say that it has to be the reductionist is someone who doesn't think there's fundamental mental stuff. That's a hard sentence to say, fundamental mental. And so I was saying that in the bacteria case, I think we wouldn't say that person's not a reductionist. Like for example, there are people, these modern and intelligent design people who I don't take very seriously, like Michael Behe and William Dembski. And what they say is that there are certain elements of the evolutionary process that couldn't have formed by evolution just by random mutations, because they think that there are certain parts where none of the parts would be useful unless you had the other parts. So they say these exhibit irreducible complexity. So you couldn't get, you couldn't get part A unless you had part B, and you couldn't get part B unless you had part A. So you'd need something to coordinate these things. Now, imagine a person who thinks this, but who doesn't think that there's any fundamentally mental stuff. Maybe they think that, like, I don't know, the universe is oriented towards achieving a goal or something like that. I would classify that person as a non-reductionist, even though that person doesn't believe in fundamentally mental stuff. So I don't think Eliezer's definition is adequate. And this is one of the sort of things we learned from philosophy, that it's very difficult to define terms, and you almost never get some very nice term that clearly delineates all the examples that fall outside of the concept from things that fall into the concept. I think with reductionism, like, you kind of know it when you see it. It's the reductionists want to be explaining there's disagreement about whether these various things are explained by at the ultimate level, the equations of physics. And the reductionists fall more on the side of saying, yes, lots of things are explained by the equations of physics. And the non-reductionists fall more on the side of saying, no, many, many things are not explained ultimately by the equations of physics. And these are just built into fundamental furniture of the universe.
Yeah, I mean, I do think what I said before there about skipping levels, I think there's a lot of people who don't know if they're reductionists or not, but in practice, they just do reductionism badly. Like there's people who look into a computer and be like, what is the simple one level reason why the computer works? And it's like, there's many layers here, right? You have to seal off the abstraction layers if you want to properly understand how a computer works. And a lot of people just intuitively suck at that. And they don't even realize they're not taking a philosophical position, that they're not reductionists. They're just like, the computer has to work for like some simple computery reason, right? It's like, well, okay, memory works like this. And then there's, step-by-step instructions, and they make algorithms, and the algorithms have like complexity properties. Like they don't really get the levels.
Yeah, so I certainly agree that people can be mistaken about the levels at which things reduce, where they can fail to identify, exactly what level things will reduce at. But I was just saying, so I guess, would you think that a guy like Behe is a reductionist?
Oh, yeah. So I wanted to address that. I actually don't see a connection with what you're saying about intelligent design with reductionism, because if you look at the intelligent design argument, and by the way, this is something when I was a college student, there were a bunch of Christians in my dorm, and they loved intelligent design because it's like a new veneer over creationism where you say, okay, look, I'm not claiming that God necessarily created all the different animals. I'm just asking questions, okay? How could evolution possibly go and create all these organs when it's clearly too hard for the search process that is evolution? And then this ties into what you're saying about what was irreducible complexity. I think the irreducible complexity, that's an argument about the nature of evolutionary search, right? Because evolution is local hill climbing in gene space. And so the intelligent design theorists, they say, look, there's the curvature of gene space. You can't just climb your way to an eye or to a wing. You have to step back and write a blueprint that combines different features of the wing if you want to eventually get the wing. You're not just going to make half a wing and get to the whole wing. It's the nature of the search space isn't going to allow that. Now, everything I just said, I think it's wrong, but even though I think it's wrong, I don't think it's non-reductionist. I think it's just a claim about the nature of genetic search space.
I guess it seems to me that it's not reductionist, where if there are lots of features of biology that you think basically don't reduce and thus have to have, like, be fundamentally built in at the ground layer, where either there's some other mysterious mechanism that brings them about that doesn't reduce, or where the things just are fundamental and nothing deeper explains them. I think if you think that, you're just not a reductionist about these things. You don't think that eyes and wings and so on are explained in terms of the deeper evolutionary process. But I mean, I guess
so I think we agree. I think we agree that intelligent design theorists, they think God created the animals, which is a non-reductionist view, but the particular argument that the complexity is irreducible, that particular argument I don't think is non-reductionist.
Well, okay, we could spend all day arguing about the definition, and I don't think that would be that interesting. But I mean, I guess imagine, I'll just say one last thing about it. Imagine a case where a person, they believe, so like, there are some people who believe that, God is responsible for irreducible complexity. And just let me be clear, I don't believe in irreducible complexity. I think evolution is the right story about how we got here. But okay, so suppose a person didn't think that God was responsible for it, but thought that, say, they had a sort of like Buddhist view where they thought that there was some, generic force of the universe that was non-mental, but that was responsible for combining things and bringing them together. I think in that case, we would say that person's not a reductionist, even though that person does not believe in fundamentally mental entities. They believe in fundamentally non-mental entities.
Wait, but didn't you just describe something like gravity? So does that make me a non-reductionist?
No. So it isn't enough. It isn't the case that just like any person who believes in anything that explains anything else is a non-reductionist. It's that, like, I think reductionism versus non-reductionism should be thought of as coming sort of on, it comes in degrees. And so if you believe, like, everyone believes in gravity, right? I guess if there was a person who thought that there wasn't any gravity and that there was some simpler stuff that everything else reduced to, that person would be more reductionist.
Well, 4D space-time, right?
Yeah, sure. Right, okay, but I think 4D space, like, gravity will emerge out of 4D space-time rather than, gravity is one of the things that exists, though it's going to be explained perhaps by something deeper. But I think we should think of reductionism as coming in degrees, where the more things you think are explained versus the number of things you think are fundamental, the more of a reductionist you are, the more you think stuff is explained by other stuff. So a guy like Behe, because he thinks that you need to build in more fundamental things, like maybe a mind, or maybe not a mind, but some natural force, a guy like Behe is going to be less reductionist than you or I, because he thinks that you need to build in more fundamental stuff in order to explain more bits of the world.
Well, so as a Bayesian, though, this gets into Occam's razor and what does it mean to introduce more stuff, right? Are you kind of making that connection where people who violate Occam's razor, perhaps they're less reductionist?
So I think the people who think, so if there are different ways of interpreting Occam's razor. I think Eliezer nails Occam's razor. That's one thing I think he's good on. I think Occam's razor is about the number of fundamental entities. Maybe with some exceptions. I think it's probably something more like the number of fundamental concrete entities. But okay, roughly the number of fundamental entities. And so I think if a person thinks that there are more fundamental entities than another person, they think that the fundamental entities like sort of take place at higher scales, where it's not just like, well, I believe in 3 fundamental particles and you believe in 2, but it's like, I believe that there's this like thing that operates at higher scales that doesn't reduce, then I think that'll contribute to them being non-reductionist.
Okay, I think I think you're being a little bit imprecise about Occam's razor, because ultimately the formulation that Eliezer and I endorse is Solomon-Off induction, where your prior probability over what might exist in the universe that you find yourself in is basically it's your hypotheses are like all possible algorithms that could explain your observation, and you're trying to use your evidence to then condition and be to do a likelihood ratio and be like, okay, based on the evidence I'm seeing, let me narrow down the algorithms. Whereas the whole universe is like running an algorithm, so it's kind of like you're in a computer simulation and you're saying, what is the code for the simulation that I live in? That's basically the nature of Solomon-Off induction, which is like the ideal, uncomputable, perfect epistemology. And the reason I'm talking about Solomon-Off induction is because when we talk about Occam's razor, it's talking what's parsimonious, what has few entities, is actually defined in terms of the short program lengths within this kind of reasoning. Does that make sense?
Yep. And I agree that that's the right way of thinking about Occam's razor. Now, a consequence of that is what I was saying, which is that if you think that it's the shortest program length needed to fully describe what's going on, then you only need to describe the fundamental things so long as you describe the fundamental things and their behavior, right? So, for example, it's not a violation of Occam's razor to think that there are lots of nebula, because the shortest program length that fully describes a physical system that produces lots of nebula isn't substantially more complicated. Now, if you were building in the nebula fundamentally, if you said that the nebula don't reduce to anything deeper, well, then I think then you have a problem. Now, I mean, I might have slight disagreements with Solomon-Off induction. I'm not an expert about it. I think something like how long does it take to describe in some ideal language is the right approach. I have quibbles about the specific language that people think it takes place in, because I think what you want out of the language, you want it to be able to build in certain things that are not basically described mathematically. So, for example, maybe we'll talk more about this when it comes to the existence of God. But I think one thing that makes theism a simple hypothesis is that it posits that there's a very simple kind of thing, which you can explain simply invoking only fundamental things, which is you invoke consciousness, which is fundamental. You say there's a consciousness wholly without limit. So fundamental thing, no limits. This is a very simple hypothesis, and then it very well explains the world. I know you're not going to agree with that. And when you say this to people who are fans of less wrong, they get very upset. Well, not upset, but they're in strong disagreement. But this is my view, and I think I think this is the right way of thinking about the simplicity of God.
Okay. Before we get to God, I just want to go back and defend Michael Behe and the intelligent design theorists for probably the last time I'll ever do this. But say what you will about them, I just don't think the particular argument when they're talking about irreducible complexity, when I first hear the argument, when they say, look, there's no way that evolution could get to a whole wing because it would have to get to half a wing first, and the half a wing wouldn't fly, so the complexity of the whole wing is irreducible. When they make that kind of argument, I don't say, aha, non-reductionist. No. I say, you know what? This argument can be settled as a question of whether genetic search has local hill climbing structure that can get you to a wing. It may or may not. If it turns out that it doesn't, that doesn't make me and Michael Behe into non-reductionists. It just says, okay, well, it says wings couldn't have evolved. So something else needs to account for wing evolution, but that doesn't imply non-reductionism yet.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, so it's hard to see what I think if we just think about intuitively how the word is used, whether we would describe Michael Behe as a non-reductionist, I think in normal English it would make sense to describe Michael Behe as a non-reductionist.
I think he's a non-reductionist, but not because of the argument of irreducible complexity, but rather just because he's a Christian.
Well, but I mean, think about the atheist Michael. The non-theist Michael Behe, that non-theist hypothetical Michael Behe, where the person believes that there's some force that's not a mind that orients things. This kind of force that orients the evolutionary process, that exerts physical forces in order to bring about desirable outcomes, where it's oriented towards bringing about the good, but it's not a mind. If a person thought that, I think it would be very strange to describe them as a reductionist. I think Eliezer's definition is too narrow, because I think in order to be non-reductionist, not being non-reductionist, it's not just about believing in fundamental minds. It's about believing in fundamental minds and believing in fundamental things that are sort of like minds in various ways. So if you believe in a fundamental force that is oriented towards value, I think that's non-reductionism. I think it's used in philosophy if you believe in fundamental moral and mathematical entities.
Sure. Look, I agree. It's just, this is what I'm getting at. Okay, we both like to nitpick, and I think that I pointed out one nitpick that you can probably agree with, which is the term irreducible complexity. When you first hear it, you might think that it has to do with reductionism, but I just pointed out that that's actually misleading. And that particular term, that particular argument, irreducible complexity, is still potentially a reductionist argument.
Okay, yeah, sorry. So if you're just disagreeing, yes, I agree that that merely thinking that there's such thing as irreducible complexity, this does not commit you to non-reductionism.
Cool. All right, nice. Let's move on to talk about God, right? This is the meat of that. And, going back to my college days, being in a dorm with a bunch of fundamentalist Christians, this is really taking me back to the 2000s because also, I'd open up Reddit. I was a very early user of Reddit, and there would be atheism debates raging on Reddit, right? This is like a very popular thing in the 2000s is, rational people versus hardcore fundamentalists, and just like debating God used to be really popular. And then people are always pointing out how like people don't debate God very much anymore. Like when I open up Twitter, I just don't see any of the people in like the tech Twitter discourse or the philosophy Twitter discourse like seriously even mentioning God in like almost any tweet. Like they don't really bring it up much. So I guess my first question is like a meta question of like, why do you think God doesn't come up in discourse that much these days?
I don't know. I remember Scott Alexander had an article about the sort of rise and fall of new atheism, and I remember reading that and thinking that it seemed kind of plausible. I think there are lots of sort of cultural movements that last for a little while and then go away, and it's often a bit mysterious why they went away. I also think that we're living in a more secular culture, and so it's harder to be extremely outraged about the excesses of religion, right? So if the president of the United States is George Bush, wait, I'm now forgetting. Is it H.W. or W? Yeah, I think
First
W
there was
was
HW and then there was W.
Yeah. I get them mixed up. But yeah, if you think if George Bush is the president and he's saying that part of the reason he's invading Iraq is because God informed him that he ought to, um, then it's much easier to be sort of very vocally anti-religion and to think that this whole religion thing needs to be razed to the ground. And if, people are passing laws against gay marriage and so on and against abortion, largely based on religious reasons, then it makes more sense that there's more backlash. In contrast, if the president of the United States is Trump, and basically, he's the face of the Republican Party, which is the more religious party, and yet he's basically the single most debaucherous and sexually immoral person on the planet, then it's not like, there's less of a battle between fundamentalist Christians who take family conservative values seriously and secular people who think these things are ridiculous. And so I think there became less religious polarization, and when there's less polarization around some subject, people tend to talk about it less.
Let's take Peter Thiel as a representative example, potentially. As far as I understand, he is a Christian, and he's pretty serious about it. And he does sometimes make references to the Bible because he's a guy who just likes to make a lot of connections, right? He's always making connections, and some of his connections are to the Bible. And to him, like, everything is connected. I don't know. He's a weird guy from my perspective. He's obviously very successful. He has a lot of wisdom that I'd like to be able to try to learn from. But like, what's the deal with so many people like him? Because obviously many Americans are Christian. I don't know what percent, tens of percents, potentially even the majority of Americans still identify as Christian. And yet the only exposure we get to their Christianity is like, okay, an occasional reference to the Bible. Like, why don't we get more?
I mean, I don't know if I agree with that. If you talk to Christians, they often tend to be pretty big on Christianity, and they'll often tell you about it. If you hang out in tech, in these sort of very atheist rationalist tech spaces, then you'll get much less discussion of Christianity. But if you hang out
but to be fair, it's not just hanging out in the space, it's also listening to podcasts.
Yeah, okay, sure. Right. If those are the sorts of podcasts you listen to, then yes, you'll get the sense that God is dead. If you say, like I did, my philosophy space is sort of split between EAs and rationalists and just philosophy people. And then there's a lot more discussion about philosophy of religion. certainly less than there used to be, but it's not like it's a completely extinct species.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this. What is your religion?
I'm not religious.
Okay. What's your view on God?
I think God exists. And I think that, so like, there are different views I have some credence in. I have some credence in Christianity. I have some credence, I have some credence in different religions, though Christianity is the one that I have the highest credence in. Um, I have some credence in a kind of pluralism where, like, different religions are sort of vaguely grokking the truth. And then I have some credence in a kind of, like, sort of the opposite of pluralism, where basically, like, there is a God, but all the religions are largely wrong about God's character, where where basically God hasn't been at play in the formation of human religions.
Okay, but hold on a second. So I know that Judaism and Christianity and Islam came around in that order. And you said that you have the most credence in Christianity. So if I understand correctly, you think the prophet Moses was the real deal, Jesus was the real deal, Muhammad was a bullshit artist.
Well, I don't think any of these people were the real deal. My credence in Christianity is probably, around like 10%. But so I'll bet at 9-1 odds that he's not the real deal. Regarding Moses, so I think if you're a Christian, you should be a kind of liberal Christian. So, for example, like, you should think that many of the events that were recorded in the Old Testament that seem to be contradicted by archaeological evidence, like a massive exodus from Egypt, you should think that these things didn't happen, and that basically, like, reflect the human errors that were part of the tradition that Jesus was part of, rather than reflecting the truth. Like, I think a very literal reading of the Bible, where you think the events that are described as happened, is quite implausible, as many of them are contradicted by the archaeological evidence. I think, for example, that the views of modern biblical scholars that the Torah was stitched together from 3 or 4 different authors, is almost certainly correct.
Okay, let's go back to the probability distribution here. So Christianity, 10%. What about P Judaism?
Maybe, like, I don't know, 2 or 3.
Okay, and P Islam?
0.5%, quarter, I don't know.
Oh, wow, only 0.5%. Okay. And you and I are both culturally Jewish, right?
What gave that away? Yes.
Oh, man. Okay, and then what about P Buddhism?
Maybe like around Islam, around like 0.5%.
What about P Mormonism?
Mormonism, I think, like, I'd have to write these out to make sure my credences are coherent.
Sure.
But like maybe like one per. No, I think lower. I think maybe like 0.6% or something.
I mean, the weird thing about Mormonism is it's so recent, right? So, but I mean, I guess all the religions are like kind of recent.
Yeah, Mormonism also has weird theological views, and it seems like Joseph Smith, like, I haven't looked into it that carefully, but it seems like Joseph Smith was a bullshit artist. There are these cases
okay,
where
Joseph Smith,
like
Muhammad. So we got to separate Jesus and Moses go on one hand, Joseph Smith and Muhammad.
I don't think we have good evidence that Moses was a real person.
Okay.
I think with Jesus, it's a bit puzzling. It seems like the best bet is that he was sort of this, he had various important moral teachings, but also thought he was the Messiah or something. I think this is probably the best bet as to what Jesus is. But I think Muhammad also seems like a crook, and seems like a deeply immoral guy who married a 6-year-old girl and had sex with her when she was 9.
That darn Muhammad. Okay,
yeah.
So that's pretty much a breakdown of the religion.
By the way, the reason my credence in Islam is so low, maybe it should have been lower, is that it like, if you're a Christian or a Jew, you can be a sort of like liberal Christian or Jew, where you think that much of what's described is sort of the byproduct of human errors creeping in, and so this is how you can explain the many bits of the Bible, both Old and New Testament, that are deeply imperfect. In contrast, if you're a Muslim, like, the whole point of Islam is that God directly dictated the Quran to Muhammad and he wrote it down. So you can't, you have to think that the Quran is at least the direct word of God. And so then when you find that it describes basically extended torture porn about like the skin of unbelievers boiling off and them getting new skin, when you read the fact about that it's, the Quran seems to suggest that God sanctions men beating women and various other just obviously grotesquely immoral bits, various bits that were factually in error. For example, the Quran, its descriptions of Solomon are very, very, very grand. It describes Solomon as like doing all sorts of very impressive things. Contrast that with the tale that you get in Kings and Chronicles of Solomon just being a sort of regular king who, was a righteous guy, but like, didn't do anything super grand. So now it turns out that the way that the Quran describes Solomon is very similar to the view of Solomon at around the time that the Quran was written in Arabia. And so you have to think that somehow basically like the tall tales that grew over the course of 800 years ended up getting more accurate about Solomon, that Solomon wasn't this magical figure, or was this magical figure, but the early writings about him like downplayed the extent of his like, the extent to which he was doing stuff, such that it got more accurate after like many hundreds of years. Sorry, not hundreds of years, thousands of years of development. This I don't think is very plausible. So the Quran is it's littered with these factual errors. It's littered with these grotesquely immoral bits, and I don't think you can explain them in a liberal way. So I think that Muslims Muslims have to be fundamentalists to a much greater extent than Jews or Christians do.
Okay, let me bring in Pascal's wager. So I've often noted on this show that I normally don't deal in Pascal's wager because I normally don't emphasize claims that have a super low probability. For example, when I'm talking about AI doom, I don't say, yeah, there's a 0.1% chance, but we really got to focus on it. No, that's not my claim. My claim is generally, hey, this thing has a pretty high probability, and that's why it's a problem. So I generally focus on things that have a pretty high probability. Now, in your case, you think that Christianity has like a 10% probability. So you're you're out of the realm of where Pascal's wager gets difficult to follow, like the argument of like, hey, you should start obeying Christianity because it might be right, and then you're going to go to heaven instead of hell. Normally, I'm like, well, we can dismiss that because the probability is so low. In your case, the probability is like 10%. So does the conclusion of Pascal's wager of saying like, hey, you better hedge, you better start following the rituals or doing whatever the Bible says to do, does that carry weight for you?
Yeah. So I guess, first of all, my credence in some kind of Christianity is around 10%. My credence in a kind of Christianity where basically you go to hell forever unless you have the right beliefs is very, very, very near zero. I find that view to be completely insane. Now, why don't I wager? First of all, okay, I'm not perfectly rational. I find it, there are certain things that maybe you kind of, intellectually see how they might be a good idea, but it's like, you just sort of concretely imagine, it's just, it's just difficult to get yourself to basically transform your life and spend lots of time doing things you take to be pointless for the sake, including things that would, deeply upset my Jewish family members for the sake of a 0.0000001% chance of heaven instead of hell. I also think that, probably I sort of have limited amount of willpower, and probably it's more productive, even if I'm just maximizing the odds of getting a good afterlife, to spend my willpower trying to do things that are valuable and that improve the world, rather than to try to get, rather than going to church every week or something, even though I think almost certainly...
But hold on, this paints a very different picture, because you said there's a roughly 10% chance that Christianity is true in some sense, but the sense in which you have a huge effect over whether you go to heaven or hell, that sense is very unlikely to you.
So I think conditional on Christianity, universalism is very likely. And I think even if universalism is wrong, universalism is the idea that everyone eventually goes to heaven. And even if universalism is wrong, I think that, whether you go to heaven or hell, it contrary to the beliefs of many evangelicals, is not just dictated by whether you have the right beliefs about Christianity. If God is perfect, it's very implausible that whether he's, gives you a good afterlife or a bad one will depend on what kinds of things you believe. Now, I think if God is perfect, everyone will get an infinitely good afterlife, though, maybe in different degrees. And maybe, maybe if you mess up in this life, you sort of, you'll have to do some things to make up for it in the afterlife or something. But yeah, if God is perfect, I find it very implausible that like you'll go to hell forever for having the wrong beliefs. And then I also think that just the biblical case for um universalism is pretty plausible. For example, it says, as in Adam all died, so in Christ all will be made alive. It describes every knee bowing and every tongue confessing. The word used for confess everywhere else in the New Testament is used to mean lovingly praise. It says in Lamentations that no one is cast off by the Lord forever. There are just all sorts of verses that I think caution against if you read your English Bible, it will look very much like the Bible is very clear that that there are people who go to hell forever. But many of these involve very tendentiously translating ambiguous Greek phrases, like the word aionios, which is consistently translated by modern English translators who are pushing an infernalist agenda as meaning forever. But it often just means of an age or of a period. In Luke, for example, people are described as the boys of the age. Presumably, were not imagined to live forever.
It's funny for me to imagine somebody with a probability distribution over religions going and dabbling in their rituals and practices. It's like, you show up to church and they read the first commandment and says, you shall have no other gods beside me. And you're like, well, 0 and 1 aren't probabilities. So I do actually have a probability distribution over other gods. Sorry.
I mean, I assume when it says you should have no other gods beside me, it's talking, it's not saying you should have no credence in there being other gods beside me. It's talking about the kinds of beings that you should worship. Because, if you look at the Old Testament, they seem to think that there were other gods, and they discuss that fairly consistently. In the book of Judges, for example, which I was just reading, there's lots of discussion about people turning to the Babylonian gods and God being like, no, I'm your God, don't worship don't follow these other gods. There seems to be this perception that the other gods are real and just like the God of the Israelites are better. Though around the time of Isaiah, monotheism became a much bigger deal where then it became thought that there was only one God.
In your view, does God answer prayers?
I don't know.
All right, so that's a maybe. Okay, how about this? I think you've mentioned this in your writing. Do miracles happen?
I don't know. I have some credence that they do. I think there are some that are surprisingly well attested. But it's also it's also like the world's a big place, and so you'd expect there to be some apparent miracle reports when they're not real.
And that seems like a really important consideration, right?
Yeah, and also it's sort of theologically puzzling why God would intervene in weird cases involving miracles. Now, maybe you can tell some story involving. I can tell you about the theodicy I like best, and maybe this will account for why miracles happen. But I think maybe miracles happen, but and I think theism, there are some that are sufficiently well attested that I think decent odds that they happened. But yeah, so I guess my overall answer is I think I lean towards thinking miracles happen, but I'm not super confident in it, and it's not where I would make my case for.
So I remember on your blog, you gave the story of one miracle that seems convincing to you, and it was like somebody's leg grew back, and you're like, there's so many different people attesting to this, so it must be real. But to me, it just seems like what you said before of look, in a world where there's no miracles, but there's still billions of people, right? And thousands of years of history. You don't think there's going to be incidents where a bunch of people are gaslighting or deceived? Isn't that already likely to come up?
Right. So this will in part depend on how many miracle reports we think there are. So, for example, Craig Keener has a 2-volume work called On Miracles, where he very carefully documents cases where it seems like there are credible miracle reports. And hundreds of millions of people claim that they've witnessed a miracle. In many cases, this is reported as one of the primary reasons why Christianity is spreading, where it's people think they've witnessed a miracle, so the Christians are right. No, right. So if there was just one case, then you could write it off as, okay, some
thinking that you've witnessed a miracle is an incredibly low standard, right? It's so easy for random events to make people think that they witnessed a miracle.
So Keener goes through and documents many of these miracles, and many of them, they at least seem it's not just one guy said they saw something. They at least seem decently well tested. I haven't finished Keener's book. I started reading it recently, but yeah. So if you look at people who are investigating miracles, And Keener's very careful in looking at the miracle claims and looking at the kinds of healings that are happening and so on. It doesn't seem like there are only like one or two miracles that are credible that have happened in all of human history. It seems like they're a decent number. We also just have to look at the particular cases and see whether there is a plausible naturalistic account. So, for example, in the case that you were talking about, where the guy regrew a leg, we have reports from huge numbers of people who knew him when he was missing a leg. We have reports from several doctors who carried out the surgery where they amputated his leg because it was infected by gangrene. He would often sleep outside, people would. We have reports from people who said they felt his leg, and then after his leg allegedly grew back, there was a year-long inquiry carried out by it was carried out by the Catholic Church, but they hired secular authorities to do it. In Spain, where they looked very carefully into it. So clearly he had his leg after this happened. The only plausible story...
What year did this happen in?
I think like 1600s or 1700s.
Okay. I mean, that's a pretty long time ago. Look, when you're telling this stuff, you sound pretty gullible.
Yeah, there are lots of things that we know happened a long time ago. We're very confident that Alexander the Great...
I know, but what I'm saying is, like, haven't you ever heard other stories that sound a lot like what you said that are also known to be wrong and BS?
No, I don't think there are... there are cases of people saying that miracles have happened, but there aren't cases of people saying miracles have happened and them being debunked after there's evidence for them that's as good as in the case of Juan Miguel Pellicer. And by the way, that's not the only evidence that he was missing the leg. The other thing is, so if you were missing a leg, you could apply for a begging license, where in Spain at the time it was illegal to beg without a license. So if you applied for a begging license, and it turned out that you were faking, then you would often be executed. Now, Pellicer successfully applied for a begging license twice because he was missing a leg. So you have to think that he both risked fooling the authorities, hoping that they wouldn't notice that he was missing a leg, and that he was successful twice. And that somehow the doctors
bribed the authorities
carrying out the surgery, and that okay. So your story is that he bribed the government.
It's not that I have a story. It's just that, look, 1,000 years have passed, right? Because you're pulling something from a few hundred years ago. There's a lot of people like you who are getting value from being able to take the position that a miracle has happened. And so when you run that kind of a search of being like, okay, where's my miracle? Where in this 1,000-year time frame is my miracle? There's a lot of people who are like, let's make this happen. Let's make a miracle happen. Let's bribe people. Let's change the documentation. Let's tell a story that isn't based in fact. Let's fake the evidence, right? The search that you're doing is going to turn up something.
Right. So I'll agree with you that imagine the way that this was the way that it was carried out, where basically like you had very credible miracle investigators who like investigated very carefully, came to the most well-attested.
Not just investigators. There's people throughout history all along the chain who they have a stake in being like, we're going to make a record that a miracle happened one way or the other. We're going to find an opportunity. Maybe we'll build on a coincidence and we'll amplify. We're gonna make this happen. It's a 1,000-year reign of human history. We're going to find a time that a miracle happened one way or the other.
Right. Now, so there are lots of different accounts of reported miracles. I discovered this one basically at random, where there's a podcast that sometimes covers miracles and alleged miracles, and I watched the podcast episode, and then this caused me to do reading about it. So this is not a case where like the number one case, like among people who think miracles have happened, this is not a very widely cited case. But
this is a miracle that you personally like. This is like your top tier miracle.
It's one that I think is decently credible. It also, part of this depends on what your existing theological beliefs are. Once you think God exists, then it becomes a lot more credible.
By the way, don't you think it'd be super convincing if the miracle just happened like in the last century?
Well,
that way we could have like a photograph, like.
Well, so there are alleged cases of miracles happening in the last century. I haven't looked into I don't spend very much of my time investigating miracles, but there are cases of more recent miracles. If people are interested, a guy named Caleb Jackson has written about.
Why don't we just have a well-documented miracle that has consensus? I don't get. Why are you reaching into the 1600s here?
Well, I think it is a well-documented miracle. I don't know
Okay,
why.
but one that's really by modern standards, well documented.
I think it's well documented. We have reports from doctors. We have reports who carried out the surgery. We have reports from about 20 of his friends who said they saw him without a leg. And we have
Okay,
reports.
but sorry, I mean convincing
he
by
applied,
modern standards, right?
And he applied for a begging license twice, and in both cases was successful.
Okay, I think the term well documented didn't mean what I wanted it to mean in that particular case, because look, records from 1600 are relatively easy to fake.
Well, the records that were from 16. So, we have records regarding this from multiple sources. I think we have newspaper reports that were written about it shortly after the fact. The investigation into the allegedly regrowing leg
but my
began.
question is just this: is why does this even have to be an argument over how good the records are? Why can't the miracles just happen often enough that once every few years or every decade somebody can just take out their phone and film the miracle?
Well, so there are a few things to say about that. One of them is that there are more recent miracles that are arguably decently credible than most of that, though I generally haven't looked into them. But there are people I respect who
You'd think there would be a TikTok account to just aggregate the miracles.
Right. Okay. So I was explaining that there are miracles that are potentially credible in the modern era. Now, regarding why the miracles aren't ubiquitous and we don't constantly see them. Well, here's one thing we know about God if he exists. God wants to remain hidden, or at least one way we know this is that God is omnipotent and remains hidden, right? If God had a desire to make himself known to the world, he could do that, right? And so if he wants to remain at least minimally hidden, he has to make it so that basically there aren't miracle reports that are so credible that everyone the world over knows them. The other point is, okay, well, I'm going to say a thing that's going to, lose me even more of my rationalist credibility, but, so if we think about what the most plausible theodicy is, the most plausible explanation of why God allows evil, one that I find very plausible is that there are basically, God set up the world, and the primary people who are tasked with making the world really amazing were these archons, these sort of angel or demon-like creatures. But these guys failed, right? So the reason why stuff sucks is that there were people who were given these archons who were given this difficult task. And basically, the archons failed in their task of making the world good. You can understand why God might do this if he's perfect, where if the archons do succeed in helping us out, then that would strengthen our connection with the archons, given that they would have done something really valuable for us. And that strengthened connection would last forever, right? And so, it ends up having the value tends towards infinity as the amount of after a lifetime goes to infinity. So it's not that implausible that they would do that. Okay, once you have this in place, then the patterns of miracles in the world, they end up making more sense. Where you'd expect a greater pattern of these sort of small, limp, relatively impotent miracles. Where if one person does a small thing happens. Basically, if it's only a small number of the people who have authority to make substantial changes in violations of the law of nature, if only a small percentage of them are interested in improving our world and in carrying out miracles, then you'd expect there to be only.
Why didn't he just regrow the leg in the era of videos? He conveniently did God say, okay, hey, nobody has a video camera, so this is my perfect opportunity to regrow somebody's leg?
Well, the account I just gave is one on which God's not the one doing the miracles, but it's these archons who are doing the miracles. And the reason why God wouldn't intervene is that it's valuable for the archons to be the difference makers, right? So if this theodicy is defended by Philip Swenson and Brian Cutter. If God is going to intervene even in the cases where the archons drop the ball, then the archons no longer make a substantial difference to how well our lives go, and then it makes it so that the archons don't have the ability to benefit us to as substantial a degree in relative terms, and so it doesn't forge as strong of connections with the archons. So the archons are the ones who are tasked with this. You might say, okay, why don't the archons do miracles, that are on video camera? Well, one reason is, as I described, that the archons want to remain hidden. Another thing is, maybe they do. So there are lots of cases where people, if you just Google, video report of miracle, you'll find lots of things on the internet where people are claiming.
There's no doubt that there are many reports, right? Because we get reports of miracles. Also in worlds where there are no miracles, we still get reports of miracles.
Right, and you'll find things where if basically the person who made the video isn't full of shit, then there really is a miracle. Now, in most of these cases, the inference is okay, but the person probably is full of shit. And most of the time, I think this is the case. And there might be some cases where a genuine miracle happens and it's recorded, but no one writes about it. It's like this doesn't.
All right. So that's God and miracles. So let's get into
I will
one
say,
of your.
this is not like the thing I'm most confident in. Like I think, and this is not one of my like major views. The other stuff that I have to say about philosophy of religion is stuff that I'm much more confident in and have more settled views on. So if you're thinking like, okay, this crazy guy thinks there are miracles, so this is a reason to discount him. Like I would encourage you, this is not the area that most of my thoughts are about.
What's your probability that a miracle as impressive as a leg getting regrown has happened?
Well, I think conditional on a miracle having happened, it's decently likely that it's been roughly as impressive as a leg having been regrown. So I'd say, around 0.5.
So 50-50, that's something that's like straight up miracle, not just like, oh, we didn't know that legs regrow under these conditions. Like, nope, it's just very much a miracle from space or God or some like mental entity, basically.
Yep.
Okay, 50%. Interesting. And then what's your P God? I forgot to ask.
That's a good question. Like in the 60s, like maybe like 64% or something. Maybe in my P miracles, I described it as being too high because I don't have a suit. Like I do think maybe there's like a third, like conditional on there being no God. Gods and miracles are very low. And conditional on there being God, I don't think it's like guaranteed. I think it's maybe like 2/3 probability. So maybe I should be at like 40% on miracles or something. But
okay, makes sense. All right, one of your favorite topics on your post so far is the fine-tuning argument for God, if I understand correctly, right? So do you want to give that in a nutshell?
Yeah. So it turns out that there are some constants in the laws of nature that are set to these very precise values, where if they differed by even a teeny amount, no interesting structures could arise. So for example, take the cosmological constant, which governs the expansion rate of the universe. If it were a little bit stronger, basically everything would immediately fly apart. No complex structures would form. And if it was a little bit weaker, everything would collapse in on itself. So if you're a theist, you have a very nice explanation of why the cosmological constant falls in this very narrow range that's about 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of the possible values it could have taken on. If you're an atheist, it's much more puzzling that it takes on this value because you don't think that it's sort of designed to take on this value. That's one element of fine-tuning. Another element that I find impressive is a more basic conceptual point, where just think about all the ways that the world could be. Most of them would just be random chaos. And of the ways that are simple, most of the very simple ways would just be particles just move in a straight line, don't do anything interesting. And so we happen to get these laws that fall in this very nice Goldilocks zone between being very complicated, where they produce random chaos, and being very simple, where they just produce totally boring order. It turns out to actually be quite difficult to get a pattern of laws that produces interesting structures like ours. So I think that the fact that we have laws that do that is very surprising on if there is no God.
I don't know the details of the physics of all these different constants. Like, I'm willing to believe that you tweak one of the constants by 1% and you screw everything up. But if you can tweak them all together, are you sure you can't turn all the dials at once and get to another point that works?
Right. Okay. So the thought is that, let's see, it's a little bit hard to explain why this doesn't work. But I mean, so one point is just physicists have tried doing this, where they've looked at what happens if you tweak a lot of the different constants. And basically, you get the same thing, where you get life rising under almost no conditions. But then there's a more basic probabilistic point, which is that in order for call a constant fragile if it's such that if you tweak it by a small amount, then no interesting structures would arise. And call it non-fragile if it's such that even if you tweak it by a lot, you would still get interesting structures. With our constants, so our constants are fragile. In order for there to be anything other than a great degree of fine-tuning, it has to be that overall, there are these large shares of probability space where the constants aren't fragile, right? If at every point like no matter what you set the other values to, the cosmological constant is really fragile, such that it falls in this minuscule portion of the range of its possible values, then you'll just inevitably need a great degree of fine tuning to get its value. The overall probability of fine tuning will be very low. Okay, so our constants are fragile, and in order for fine tuning to be likely, you need for the constants to be non-fragile. But if the constants are non-fragile for much of the probability space, then it's super unlikely that we got a fragile constant. So in other words, the explanation is inadequate because it doesn't explain why we happen to get a constant that falls in this range, where if you tweak it slightly, you wouldn't get any interesting structures arising.
Right. I mean, so I get that there's a sense in which if you take one dial and turn it a little bit, you screw it up. But I'm just curious, is there some guardrails or some constraints that if you superimpose those, suddenly it highlights a bunch of these 10-dimensional points? Like there's 10 constants. You're now navigating a 10-dimensional space representing the values of all the different 10 constants. Maybe the 10-dimensional space becomes a lot safer and friendlier if you apply some constraints on top of it, right? And I just don't know enough physics to know what kind of constraints we could be dealing with.
Well, okay, so the statement that you made, so maybe now it sounds like you're saying maybe there's some deeper physical explanation.
Well, what I'm saying is like what this intuition that you're invoking of like, look, the dial turns relative to turning this one dial, it's a tiny fraction of the dial, but maybe the dial actually looks like a smarter dial, right? A dial that's under some constraints.
Okay, so you're saying maybe only like the only possible values that it can take on are the value of the cosmological constant.
Well, I'm saying if you're going to change the cosmological constant, imagine that you have a dial board where you try to change the cosmological constant, but it automatically snaps the other dials to a point where they can work well with it.
Okay, so now it sounds like this is the deeper physics explanation, where you're saying maybe there's some explanation in terms of deeper physics for why you have to get a sequence of laws that produce a sequence of constants that produce interesting structures.
Let me say what I'm getting at here is like when you say, hey, these constants are all fine, you may be right, like that, they're all finely tuned. You may be right, but it's just I'm just trying to get a sense of this idea of what could they have been, because I think it's very naive to be like, okay, well, they could just have been any numbers. Each of them could have been any number. And it's like, well, wait a minute, maybe they go together, right? Like, or maybe they come in clusters, or you pick which cluster of these constants you want, and the clusters are always like self-consistent.
Right. Okay. So there are a few things to say about this. One of them is that if we're being Bayesians, a Bayesian, you're not supposed to set your credences split across the possible. Like, yes, it's possible that there are deeper physical laws that set the cosmological constant to being its exact value, or that require the cosmological constant to take on some special value in combination with the other constants. But it's also possible that you could imagine there being a value, deeper laws that require the cosmological constant to be any of the differing values.
Sure. Okay. I think I don't think we disagree too much yet. I think we both agree that like there may be something here in terms of like, yeah, this is like a tiny fraction of what they could have been. I'm just pointing out that even this concept of like, let's enumerate all the ways they could have been might not be what you think it is. But like, I'm happy to take the premise of like, okay, it looks like they could have been other things.
So when we talk about what they could have been, this is in terms of epistemic probability. It's not in terms of like what's consistent with physics. Like here's an analogy. Like suppose we grant determinism. Someone goes to Vegas and they get 10 royal flushes in a row. It won't do to say, oh, maybe it couldn't have been anything else because of the laws of physics. Because yes, it's true that the laws of physics might be such that they fix it to be that the person gets 10 royal flushes. But it's also conceivable, you could imagine the laws of physics being such that it fixes it to any other value. And so the epistemic probability of it fixing it to this value is no higher than the epistemic probability of it fixing it to the other values.
We're having a discussion about, when you say epistemic probability, you're basically talking about Bayesian priors, correct?
That's right.
So you seem to be assuming that one's Bayesian prior, if one were doing Solomon-off induction, one would just have a variable saying like, okay, how big is the cosmological constant? And every value is an equal probability distribution. Whereas I'm saying you may find in the space of algorithms that can describe a universe like ours, you may find that when you take an equally likely algorithm, the algorithms actually already imply a cluster of constants. They don't just have an arbitrary constant that's uniformly distributed.
Right, but you could have it's imaginable that you'd have the algorithm imply our specific cosmological constant, but it's equally imaginable that the ideal algorithm would describe some other value of the cosmological constant. And so overall, this won't affect the epistemic probability.
So we agree that both of these algorithms exist, but I think we may be disagreeing on what does the a priori probability distribution of the algorithms look like.
Right. Okay. So your suggestion is that maybe the a priori probability is such that the odds of getting a cosmological constant that produces interesting structures just has a higher probability as a result of being produced by the
exactly.
optimal.
Like you see them as these 10 constants, but I see it as like this higher structure where actually there's a bunch of points on the structure that give you 10 tuned constants for free.
Right. So I don't think this can be right. I mean, I think the things I've said already are one problem with this, where because you could imagine it taking on a whole range of values. But the other point is that I think this is ruled out by the following consideration. So it turns out that the value of the cosmological constant. Okay, well, so here's one kind of principle of how the values are set. The way the values are set is non-teleological. So if you're looking at what the laws of physics look like at the smallest scales, this is not determined by what kinds of things they produce at larger scales. So long as this is right, you can't have a reason to privilege the laws that produce complex structures, at least regarding the Higgs mass and the cosmological constant, for the following reason. The thing that determines whether the complex structures will form based on the cosmological constant depends on a whole range of other elements of physics. Depends on how much mass there is, the value of tons and tons of different things. And so long as you don't think that there's any force that sets a cosmological constant that in some way looks at what it'll do at large scales, then it has to be that you don't think that the arbitrary seeming cosmological constant value is any likelier to be arrived at than any of the other.
If I understand correctly, maybe what you're saying is like if you're just throwing the dice and picking the universe out of your probability distribution, even if the universe is like logically consistent and it can exist and it doesn't contradict itself, don't you think that most of the universes will just have only like rocks and plasma and not like interesting life and structure? Is that basically what you're getting at?
No. What I was saying was that, let's see, what's a good analogy? Okay, let's imagine we discovered that there were that there were these really, really tiny blocks that exert some force. And the force that they exert is such that, they're these tiny blocks and they push out across the universe. And basically, this is the only thing preventing the universe from collapsing in on itself. And in order for the value that the blocks have to be set at in order to give rise to life is this very, very narrow range, where if they were a little weaker, then the universe would collapse. And if they were a little bit stronger, then the universe would expand out. And the value that they need to be will depend on the values of everything else in physics. The optimal value of these blocks need to be is affected by the value of everything else in physics. Well, you couldn't say that. So long as you think that what the blocks do, what value they're set at, doesn't depend on what they do on these large scales, then you can't think that there's anything special about this value, because the only respect in which the value is special is in regards to what it does at these larger scales. And with the cosmological constant is analogous to the blocks. The only thing that's special about this value of the cosmological constant, it's this sort of arbitrary random number. The only thing that's special about it is what it does at these very large scales, where that's affected by the values of everything else in physics. So as long as you think that the value of the cosmological constant isn't affected by what it does regarding by what it does at large scales, then you have to think that the value that our cosmological constant doesn't have a special value, and thus, when assigning priors, you shouldn't give it a higher prior than any of the other cosmological constants that there could be.
Yeah, okay, I hear it. I think it may be connected to what I was saying before, which is like it could have been a different value, and the universe might still exist, but it wouldn't have humans in it. Is that right?
Oh no, so I don't. That sounds like a different objection, but I don't think that's. Uh, wait, sorry, wait. You're saying you're asking if my point is that if the cosmological constant were different, then the universe would still exist, but wouldn't have humans in it.
Yeah, exactly. Because when we talk about these constants being fine-tuned, I think there's a couple of senses that they could be fine-tuned to just have a logically consistent universe that like survives for a while and has some structure in it, compared to they're fine-tuned to also have humans or interesting life.
Okay, well, when we talk about the cosmological constant, uh, with the cosmological constant, the idea is if it weren't set to this very precise value, basically either the world would collapse immediately or everything would
Hmm.
fly apart immediately and no two particles would interact. So, like, you couldn't get, like, life forming under different conditions if the cosmological constant weren't finely tuned. You would just get everything fly apart or everything collapse immediately.
Okay, so I'm not convinced that collapse very quickly versus fly apart very quickly. I'm not sure. I just don't know enough physics to know how fine-tuned that particular number is. I don't know. Are you sure you know?
Yeah, I mean, the value, so the thought is it takes on a value that's on the range of 1 in 10 to the power of 120 of the values it could take. And basically, if it didn't fall in this range, that's 1 part in 10 to the power of 120 of its possible
I
values.
mean, it's just like, I don't, but why can't we just be living in a universe where, scientists used to not know if the universe is expanding or there's going to be a big crunch. And I think they ended up realizing, okay, it's expanding. So isn't there some range where we can still have billions of years, even if it is going to crunch or even if it is going to expand? Why does it have to be perfectly tuned?
Well, the kind of fine tuning that I'm describing is that if it weren't in this very narrow range, you'd either get it immediately crunching or immediately having everything fly apart. And to be
So
clear,
I just
like,
don't know. No, that doesn't really make sense given my limited understanding of physics. Like, why isn't there a range where it can like expand a little bit?
well, there is a range where it could expand a little bit. But if you look at the shit, so okay, look, so imagine, this is the value of the cosmological constant. If it's here, everything collapses. If it's here in this very, very tiny range, then things expand for a little bit and then either crunch or heat death. If it's here, everything flies apart immediately. So
Okay, so
we
you're
happen to
saying
get
there
this.
is a range. It is continuous, but it's just very small.
That's right. And to
Okay.
be clear, the stuff about cosmological constants, the stuff about fine tuning, like, this is not something that theists made up. This is something that there's a broad consensus on among physicists, that basically any physicist that you talk to other than Victor Stanger will agree, and Victor Stanger's a crackpot, will agree that that there is fine tuning for the cosmological constant.
Yes.
Many people
Okay.
who are these vehement atheist physicists agree that there is fine tuning. Now, there's disagreement about exactly what to think about it, but there's very broad
Yeah.
agreement
Yeah.
among physicists that there
Yeah,
is this
and by the way,
puzzle.
I'm willing to move forward with your premise that there's fine tuning, at least in the sense where like a lot of naive ways that it seems like you should be able to tweak things don't work. I'm willing to accept that premise. It does disagree with another intuition I have though, which is, in computer science we talk about how everything wants to be Turing complete. Where you'll just have like a little domain specific language. I always use the example of CSS, cascading style sheets. Like, hey, look, here's some stuff you can type in order to govern what color this element is. But pretty soon you layer on a few features and like, oh, you can write entire programs in CSS, right? Or like video games, like, hey, let me add this dynamic to my video games. Like the characters can do this, or you can build this, and then pretty soon, you can make an entire subworld inside the video game. So in computer science, everything wants to be Turing complete. In cellular automata, which are like these toy universes that are just made out of simple rules on two-dimensional grids, or you can have any number of dimensions. In cellular automata, yeah, most of the rules that you define for a cellular automaton don't get you anything too interesting, but there is a pretty nice distribution of cellular automata that are Turing complete that you can have entire worlds in, and even arbitrarily large worlds. So cellular automata don't seem to require that much fine-tuning, and that advises my intuition that maybe physical universes don't require that much fine-tuning.
Well, okay, so like, cellular automata, when you talk about interesting stuff they result in, basically they generally result in like dots moving around, as in,
Dots
for
move around,
example.
but the dots can correspond to arbitrarily complex programs, and even if you're a reductionist, minds.
Yeah, but if you run John Conway's Game of Life, you won't get a mind.
You could. If you give it initial conditions that have Turing machines in it, you absolutely could get a mind.
Okay, well, right. So I guess if you like arrange the dots in ways that you think represent information or something, then
That's the universe, man. The universe is just dots representing information, right? Or it's mathematical quantities representing information.
well, okay. I obviously don't agree with that.
Okay.
But so you could have that, but then you're building the complexity into the initial state. It's very hard to get like a kind of cellular automata that gives rise, and there aren't any examples of this that would, if you run it, give rise to this very complicated universe with physical stuff in it that just from these initial physical conditions can give rise to a mind.
Well,
so I think
you can
there
take
is.
Elon Musk's brain, you can encode it as a cellular automaton, and then you can just give it the instructions like, hey, go build the universe, and Elon Musk will take it from there. The game of life version of Elon Musk can go build that other stuff.
Yeah, but then you're building complexity into the initial conditions by having the initial conditions involve Elon Musk's brain.
Yeah, but it's much less complexity than what results, right? It's folded complexity. That's how these things work. Like the Big Bang was low entropy, and then you get humans expanding.
Look, I don't deny that things, you can have things that get more complex over time. My claim is that, so first of all, this is orthogonal to the discussion about the fine-tuning of physics and physics. This is just this more basic conceptual point that like laws that do interesting stuff are rare.
But they're not that rare in cellular automata. They're only a little bit rare.
They're pretty rare in cellular automata, and they're especially rare in cellular automata if you have to start with highly specific, like if you have to start with simple both laws and initial conditions. Like if you have to start with laws that are very, very simple, then you're quite unlikely to get cellular automata.
Of course, initial conditions are hard, but if you can trigger any kind of evolutionary process, right, that's how you bootstrap complexity.
Right, but most of the ways you can have cellular automata where you start with some initial conditions do not evolve you to some complex state. And if they do, they're more likely to get you, say, a Boltzmann brain, where a brain that randomly fluctuates into existence and disappears, than to get stable complexity for there to be creatures living on planets over the course of a long period of time.
Yeah, but if you ask why our universe has humans in it, it's not because the initial conditions were so fine-tuned as to get humans. It's because the initial conditions were so fine-tuned as to get a planet like Earth that has a replication and mutation loop, right? The evolutionary process. And it's not that hard to have a universe where you can bootstrap an evolutionary process.
Well, it's hard to bootstrap. So it's hard to get a universe where you have a sequence of agents. Sorry, it's hard to get a universe where you have some process starting from a simple initial condition that, by following a simple set of laws, will get you this complicated universe that's able to give rise to anything that might be an agent. Maybe you'll get, as in Conway's Game of Life, you'll get gliders moving around in these simple patterns. But from initial physical conditions, you won't get anything with anything like the complexity of an agent. The other thing is that, so this is about from the fine-tuning of the laws, which I agree, I think the fine-tuning of the laws is impressive. Like, if you delete any of the four fundamental laws of physics, then I think with the exception of maybe like the weak nuclear force, then basically nothing interesting would have happened. If you delete gravity, for example, then things would start moving in one direction and they would keep going. So I think that the fine-tuning of the laws is impressive, and this can be seen both conceptually, where just like the simplest patterns for how stuff can happen don't produce anything interesting. But the thing I was talking about was the fine-tuning of the constants.
No, for sure. So all I'm saying is, I mean, it's I know we've zoomed in a lot. So just to zoom back out, I think we can move through this argument faster, because I haven't even mentioned Anthropic yet, the Anthropic argument yet, which I think is probably even more of my central pushback. But just to zoom out. So you said the constants are fine-tuned. I'm definitely open to that, but I also have an intuition from cellular automata that it's not that rare to have these super interesting, rich universes that have agents in it. It's not that miraculous. It may be in the particular type of physical universe that we happen to find ourselves in. It may be impressive if you zoom into there, but if you just zoom out and be like, what are all the mathematical structures that could have interesting agents in it? You do have a lot of choices on some level. So that's one observation that I have. But then maybe more directly to your point is, like, let's say we both agree, okay, well, it's a less than 0.1% fraction of universes, right? I think we can both agree there that if you look at all mathematically consistent universes, surely less than 0.1%, that's a very easy bar to clear, right? That we're in the top 0.1% of universes that are interesting, right?
Yeah. And sorry, let me just make one brief point about what you just said. So the values that it can both be the case that let's say you think that our universe, let's even say you don't think our universe is that interesting. It's only in the top 50% of interesting universes. Mm-hmm. Nonetheless, I think that our universe would still, so long as you agree with the fine-tuning of the cosmological constant, be evidence for fine-tuning, because maybe the law structure isn't that interesting, but it's very surprising given the law structure that you hit this very, very tiny point along the law structure where you get interesting structures. So in other words, it doesn't matter what share of the total laws give rise to interesting stuff, so long as our laws happen to be such that you have to hit this very, very tiny constant across the law structures, and it does.
And sorry, how does that in your example, can it still be like there's a 49% chance that it happened? Is that still impressive for you?
Well, so what I'm saying is, if you grant there's a 50% chance of laws giving rise to life, that wouldn't affect the fine-tuning argument. I mean, maybe it would affect it a little bit, certainly, but it wouldn't. It would still be massive evidence, because it's so. Even if you think that it's not that surprising, the mere fact that there's life, there is a fact that is very surprising on naturalism, and that fact is that given that we have the laws that we do, we have a constant that falls in this highly narrow range to give rise to complex structures. So the points you are making are about the laws, and just we need to distinguish between the laws and the constants. And the point about the laws, I think they are fine-tuned. Maybe we disagree about that just to some degree, but certainly the constants are very finely tuned. And this is something that there's a very broad consensus on among physicists. And in fact, the discovery came from physicists. It didn't come from apologists trying to artificially make an argument.
Yep. Okay, fair enough. I mean, I agree there's something there for sure, right? So I wasn't trying to push back super hard. So let's move on to the Anthropic Principle, which is just, in a nutshell, it's just like, look, we are here. Anthropic refers to like humans. So we're humans. We have minds. We're using the minds to talk about physics. So like, what were you expecting to find, right? Like when you go back and look at I guess maybe you could say, well, I was expecting to find that the constants could have been a bunch of different values, not just a very narrow range of values. Is that basically what you were expecting?
So two things. The first one is something can be evidence for a hypothesis, even if had the thing not turned out the way it did, and you wouldn't have been around to observe it, right? Okay, so let's imagine, so here's a famous case in the philosophy literature. There's a firing squad, 100 people, they all fire their guns at me, and every single one of their guns jams, and I get away. Now, you can similarly say, well, if their guns hadn't jammed, you wouldn't be alive. But nonetheless, that their guns jammed is very strong evidence that there's a conspiracy of some sort to save my life, because it's so unlikely that they would jam by chance. Sure. In a similar way, even though had there not been fine-tuning, we wouldn't have been around to observe it. The fact that there is fine-tuning is strong evidence for theism.
Yeah. So I think the answer to my question is what I said, which is like, yeah, I would have a priori expected to see that we're in a universe where you could change the laws and we'd still be in a similar universe.
Well, what I would have a priori expected is for there to be no life at all. And if there is life, I would have expected it to be in a world where the constants aren't finely tuned.
Right, exactly. Okay, so I think that's basically the answer. So yeah, I mean, the Anthropic Principle versus the fine-tuning argument. I mean, I guess I would just expect that you just, even if there is fine-tuning, it's just like, look, you look at the space of all mathematical universes, you collect together all the ones that support human life, and then you could randomly select which one I'm in. So maybe I'll be in something more like an elegant cellular automaton. Maybe I'll be in this crazy physical world where the constants look fine-tuned. Like I could have instantiated neither one. Okay, I'm in the one with the fine-tuned constants. So I agree that it's suspicious. Like they shouldn't be super fine-tuned, but like I guess my conclusion is just that like I bet there's a sense in which they're less fine-tuned than they look like, and like the physicists got to keep working on that. Because like I agree, it's weird for sure.
Well, so if you're right, if the explanation is maybe the physicists, after they work on it, will come up with a better explanation. For reasons I've already explained, I don't think that holding out for deeper physics is viable, because the deeper physics can only affect the Bayes factor if you basically believe in teleology. Where like, as I described, the what the values have to be set at on the small scales in order to get life will depend on what happens at large scales. So as long as you think that what's setting their value at the small scales doesn't affect, it doesn't depend on what they'll do at large scales, then you have to think that it's very surprising, given that their values are sort of random and arbitrary, that they have the values that they do. So you should assign basically like just a linear prior across the values they might be, or a log prior or something.
I mean, I think that your observation is one about math and physics. It's not even personal to us. It's just like, hey, if you just look at the space of all mathematical universes, there's this region of mathematical universe that we call real world physics. And in that region, it's like mostly crap, but there's like a small cool part of it, right? That's just like a statement about math and logic, right?
Well, it's something we discovered from physics, that our laws are such that only a small portion of the values of the constants, which are the numbers that you plug into the physical equations, give rise to anything interesting.
Right, but it is ultimately it's a statement about mathematical structures, right?
I don't know exactly what you mean by that question.
I mean, our physics, like, what is physics? There's a bunch of mathematical structures, and our reality is
Okay, in that
one
sense,
such.
yes, it's a
Yeah.
statement about physics, and physics is just math. So, okay, yes, it's a
Yeah.
statement about math.
Okay. I mean, if we were to wake up in Conway's game of life, which I don't think is the ideal cellular automaton because, like, it's not time reversible, or like it has some issues, but it might work. So if we were to wake up in Conway's game of life, would you have a similar reaction, or would your fine-tune argument change?
I mean, I think if we woke up in Conway's game of life, I think that there would be a fine-tuning argument, but it would probably be from the initial conditions. Right, so in order to get anything that looks roughly mind-like, you need to have really special initial conditions from Conway's game of life. So if we woke up in Conway's game of life, it would be reasonable to say, wow, we got really improbable initial conditions, and so there would be
Well,
a fine-tuning
there was
argument.
some big bang, right, where it was like a really huge big bang, so it led to a lot of different initial areas with initial conditions, and yeah, a lot of them just fizzled out as like those bricks, right, and like little blinking things. But some of the regions kicked off an evolutionary process, which ultimately led to mites. Like, imagine that
Right. Well,
happened.
so now your explanation is analogous to the multiverse, and we can talk about whether the multiverse explanation is adequate of fine tuning. But right, so I guess so in the Conway world, given that you need fine tuning of the initial conditions to produce anything interesting, um, then I
Well,
think
you
the
just need a
argument.
big bang, right? You need the laws of Conway, and you need some sort of big. Like, you don't need. I don't think that the Conway Big Bang has to be that fine tuned.
What? Look, if you just place down dots randomly in Conway's game of life, you won't get a mind. Okay, you won't get any. Like, you'll get things fizzling out very quickly, or
Again,
or
you need
quickly
to get to
diverging to
bootstrapping an
simpler pattern.
evolutionary process, which in our universe, you can see there's tons of failed attempts, right? You needed so many atoms to have a shot at getting a planet with an evolutionary process. And so you can do the same thing in Conway. You can just take a ton of shots within Conway's game of life until you get an evolutionary process.
Well, but if you have nearly if you have nearly all initial conditions regarding Conway's game of life, you won't get a bunch of different things, some of which are evolutionary processes. Almost certainly, you'll just get things fizzling out very rapidly.
I think within the game of life, you can have evolutionary processes. So it's just a matter of like getting enough configurations that one of them becomes an evolutionary process.
Okay, but in order, so there are some processes that might evolve in some ways, but to have a very specific initial state in order for it to evolve. Uh, in order to get any of these processes that evolve in any way that doesn't fizzle out very rapidly, and forms an in Conway's game of life, you mostly just get like dots moving around in fancy ways. You don't get like you need a very specific set of initial conditions in order to get. Uh,
So the part of our universe that I don't think is very impressive is the Big Bang, right? Because it seems like it was very wasteful, right? Like, it just dumped a bunch of crap on all these different galaxies, and we just have this one place in the known universe that kicked off an evolutionary process. So similarly, don't you think there's like other places in math space where you can have a wasteful Big Bang, and then one corner is going to have an evolutionary process?
Also, the kind of fine tuning that there is in our world, maybe there's fine tuning about the initial conditions. I've heard some people claim that, but I haven't looked into it very carefully. But the kind that there's lots of agreement about among the physicists is fine tuning for the constants. Okay, that's what there's fine tuning for, which are the values that go into the physical equations. Now, regarding Conway's game of life, well, you don't have any constants, and so there isn't the like there might be a fine tuning argument, and I think there is from the
There's a
initial
few constants,
conditions.
right? I mean, because there's a bunch of ways you can tweak Conway, which and by the way, Conway itself, like I said, is probably a bad candidate. But like, there's a bunch of like there's a version of Conway that's time reversible. That's a little bit different. So those are, I mean, you can pick different cellular automata from the bag. So that's kind of like tweaking constants.
Okay, well, that's not tweaking constants. That's tweaking the laws. The constants are the things that go into the equations in physics, the numbers that go into the equations in physics.
Okay, but there it is a little bit of a gray area. What's a law versus what's a constant?
Not really. The constants are numbers. Laws are descriptions of the things.
Well, in Conway's game of life, for example, there's a rule about how a square depends on its neighbors. So what if I said this square actually depends on two neighbors away? Would that be a new constant or a new law?
Um, Okay, I think you're right that there is some ambiguity between the constants and the laws. Okay, yes. But yeah, so yeah, I guess exactly what you count as a constant or a law. Maybe, I mean, I think maybe that would count as a constant just because it's a number that you plug in.
I
Right,
mean, look,
but
ultimately, but we both are using the ontology of algorithms and Solomon-Off induction, and within that ontology, there's not a hard distinction.
okay, sure. Um, but right, so like it's a conceptual distinction of how to think about it. But I mean, regarding Conway's game of life, like if it turned out that, like, okay, let's imagine that you had some set of initial conditions, and the initial conditions, they moved around and they did interesting stuff, and you had to modify Conway's game of life, where what things did depended on what was happening exactly 958 squares to the left, and basically, like, if that number were anything different, then everything would immediately self-destruct. If that were the case, that would be, and we find ourselves as minds in this world, that would be a pretty impressive fine-tuning argument. And actually, that would be a much less impressive fine-tuning argument than the one in our world, because that it's not on the order of like 1 and 958th of the parameter space. It's on the order of 1 part in Google of the parameter space.
So, I mean, look, I think we're both on the same page. Like within mathematical structures, there are these small local regions. And I was just pointing out, the reason I'm bringing out cellular automata is because for me, it's very significant to be like, look, there's other mathematical structures that I'm not 100% sure, but it seems like there are a lot of candidate universes. So even though the one that we're really in seems very impressively fine-tuned, I also think that there's other fine-tuned points. And maybe we just got randomly selected out of all these different fine-tuned points where we could live in.
Well, but the point is, if our constants are randomly selected, even if they're not randomly selected, but just like if you have a credence across them, but if they are randomly selected, well, it's very unlikely that you would randomly get our particular constant. Like, it's on the order of a probability of 1 in Google. Right.
So all right, why don't we do this? Why don't we just move on and be like, okay, you know what? This fine-tuned constant, like, we just had to be here. It's like this or nothing. And that's like a very interesting fact about math. Like, why does this 1 point so special? And then we found ourselves here.
Yeah,
fine.
well,
so let's say I accept that. So then let's move on to like, so what should I conclude?
Well, sorry, let's just, let me just discuss the fact of fine-tuning a bit more specifically. So there are 2 facts. Fact 1 is that we have our laws, and fact 2 is that we have the constants given the laws that fall in this infinitesimal range and to give rise to complex structures. Now, the fact that we have our laws, I think, is quite impressive. I think this is evidence for theism, because most laws produce random, nothingness, are incapable of producing anything interesting, while we lucked out and got laws that are capable of producing anything interesting. So we lucked out with the laws. So first update on the laws, which gives the evidence for theism. And then you update on the constants given the laws, which fall in the one part of the parameter range where they give rise to complex structures. This one tiny slice out of a possible range that's about Google times the size of the slice. And this second fact is like ridiculously surprising. So it doesn't matter how much you count the first fact about the kinds of law structures. What's very surprising, and what the people who talk about the fine-tuning in physics talk about, is the surprisingness of the second fact. But okay, so what are the takeaways of fine-tuning? Well,
exactly.
I think one takeaway is that your credence in God should go up. Namely, fine-tuning makes sense if there is a God.
And if there was no God, where would I currently be existing?
You wouldn't be.
Okay, so aren't you just saying God is synonymous with existence? I mean, because you're basically saying this is the only thing that could have happened. So if it's the only thing that could have happened, why is it evidence for God?
Well, no.
Like, you see what I'm saying? That there has to be a situation where I exist and God doesn't exist, and then you can point out, look, Leron, you're not in that situation because you have evidence for the other situation where God does exist.
Well, no, this is not the right way of thinking about probability. Something can be evidence for a hypothesis, even if, had it not turned out that way, then you wouldn't be around, right? So think back to
it's the definition of evidence that evidence is something which is more evidence for hypothesis H is something that you observe more commonly if H is true than if H is false.
That is not true. What evidence is something that's likelier if H is true than it's false, not something that you're more likely to observe if it's true than if it's false. So, for example, that you're alive today, that you woke up today is evidence that you're alive today. But you're not any more likely if you hadn't been alive today, there would have been no observations regarding your waking up today.
Right. So now we're basically talking about like which reasoning algorithms are we installing where. So I'm ultimately a human, and we're talking about how a human like me should reason. And you're basically saying, well, anytime that you exist, you're just always going to exist in a universe that has a god. There's no such thing as a human existing in a universe that doesn't have a god. So it's just like a
Well, I
purely
didn't, I
logical
didn't,
truth.
well, I didn't
Yeah.
say that. So I think there are two, like, there are different facts that are surprising. One of them is it's surprising that you exist, where the probability that you would exist is higher if God exists than if God doesn't exist. And then even after you exist, it's surprising, given that God doesn't exist, that you would exist in a world that has finely tuned constants, right? So it's old news that we exist. This is something we've been aware of for most of our history, that we exist. But what we discovered around 1980 is that there were finely tuned constants that had to be set in this minuscule range in order to give rise to complex structures.
Yeah, and
Given our
I'm
laws.
willing to accept that that is a good characterization. And so I'm still a little bit confused about how does that situation, like, okay, so I accept God, like maybe you can be a little more specific about what God is in this case.
Like, you want the definition of God?
Yeah, like what, so let's taboo the word God, right? So what exactly am I accepting here?
A well, a perfect being of limitless power, knowledge, and goodness who made the world.
Okay, like how are you deriving perfect from this argument?
Well, the argument alone doesn't get you to perfection. Well, so we've ruled out naturalism. We've ruled out lots of views that aren't compatible with fine tuning. Maybe there are some limited designers, but I mean, think that the conceptual point that I was making before of just like only a very small share of probability space of ways that ultimate reality could be produce anything interesting. This also applies to possible agents, right? So if you have most agents with a random set of powers, the vast majority of them, right? U.S. wrongers love the orthogonality thesis. The vast majority of agents would not want to produce a universe like this one. So given the vast majority of possible agents, most like limited designers, there wouldn't be anything valuable. And you have to set their desires and powers and so on to a very stuff they know to a very specific range in order to get them to produce a universe like ours. So it pushes the fine tuning back a level to who fine tunes the tuner. In contrast, if you have a god that's just a wholly limitless mind, then this god being completely without limit, this is very simple to describe. It doesn't have parameters that you have to set to arbitrary values, and it would be predisposed to pursue the good, at least plausibly, because one commonly held thesis is that the good is self-motivating. So if you're fully rational and you recognize...
Can I clarify? You think your God doesn't require parameters because the fine tuningness of the universe just says, well, it's whatever parameters make the universe that humans are in.
That wasn't what I was saying. What I was saying was that if you have a god that is this sort of limited, like a lowercase g god that's this limited deity, then you have to set its powers and knowledge and so on to some arbitrary amount in order to get it to produce a universe like this. In contrast, if you have a god that's just a completely unlimited mind, then it doesn't have any parameters that you're setting to specific values. It has one parameter, being a mind, and this is, or being a consciousness, and this is instantiated wholly without limit. And so it doesn't require this arbitrary fine tuning of the parameters of the agent itself. So if you have any agent other than God, then there's a question of who fine tunes the tuner, right? Because then it's this sort of complicated entity rather than this just simple, unlimited consciousness.
Let's get back to this idea of I observed the surprising observation that the constants are fine tuned. Isn't that just an observation about math, right? Like, okay, yeah, so math only allows some universes to have life. Okay, but again, like, what does that have to do with God?
Well, the idea is if God exists, the probability of the constants being set in this narrow range needed to give rise to complex structures and therefore life is higher than if God doesn't exist.
All right, so I'm a human. I wake up. My physicist noticed that constants look really fine-tuned. Now I've learned something about regions of mathematical structures, right? So the mathematical structures that could be physics, oh, look, this range of them is fine-tuned. But so what, right? I mean, how could it have been different? It doesn't be like, oh, maybe I could have been born in a range where the constants aren't fine-tuned, because that range doesn't necessarily exist in all of mathematical structures.
Well, I'm not sure if I get the point. It sounds like you're saying that if it hadn't been finely tuned, then I wouldn't be here. But as I was saying earlier.
No, that's not what I was saying. I'm saying, well, that's part of it, but the other part of it is like, there's no other place I could be. There's no other set of laws of physics where I could wake up and look at them and be like, hey, look, these aren't fine-tuned. I feel like fine-tuned is just how physics has to be, is what I've learned.
Well, maybe fine-tuned. So I don't know if the physics has to be fine-tuned in order to produce creatures like us. But if it does, then I think the fact that there are creatures like us is very surprising. Given theism, given atheism, if the what you're doing is you're taking that you exist somewhere as a given, being like, okay, what is the different probability of your existence in different scenarios? But if the odds of your existence are low, then the fact that you exist is very strong evidence for theism. Just like here's an analogous case: the fact that you exist gives you very strong evidence that your parents did not use extremely effective contraception, okay? Because even though if they had, you wouldn't be around, nonetheless, the fact that you are around gives you evidence for that hypothesis.
Right. So evidence that they didn't use contraception. Right, but it's just, I guess let's contrast it with the argument that, Max Tegmark's level 4 universe of just like all mathematical structures that could exist do exist. Would that be a satisfactory explanation?
Yeah, so that would explain fine-tuning, at least, because you would get some mathematical structures arising that give rise to that give rise to a universe like that, right? So if you have a multiverse of some sort, then you can explain fine-tuning. But then I think that'll have other problems. In particular, in the case of Tegmark's universe, I think that collapses induction, where if there are infinite people, basically too many people to be a set, and there are the same number of people who are deceived as there are who live on planets like you, right? So there are an infinite number of people who are like these brains that briefly fluctuate into existence, that hallucinate being you, and then that briefly die. In fact, there are no more. In both cases, it's too many to be a set of people who are on real planets and people who are like this. So this makes it so that the rational credence in, say, the sun rising tomorrow should just be utterly undefined. So I think the Tegmark view is completely unworkable and collapses induction.
So this might actually be the strongest part of your argument, which is not, like, when I asked the question of, like, how else could it have been, and you were going in the direction of being like, well, it doesn't have to necessarily be any other way, just the fact that it's this way is evidence. And now it sounds like you're making a stronger argument where you're like, well, it could have also been that you're a Boltzmann brain and you notice a lot of weirdness in your world because you're just kind of flashing into existence and not everything has to look consistent. And the fact that you don't observe that, the fact that you're not a Boltzmann brain, but you're in this fine-tuned universe, it seems like, that's evidence that somebody went and selected this universe for you, right? Somebody perfect or whatever.
Yeah, well, so there are two different things that are surprising. So the thing that's surprising is that you're in a universe that's finely tuned. And this is surprising because if there's just one universe, it's highly unlikely that there would be a finely tuned constant. Now and I don't think your response about how, well, if it weren't finely tuned, you couldn't be here, so all the possible yous find yourself in finely tuned universes. I think that's completely irrelevant, because it doesn't matter if you couldn't have found yourself. Like, the fact that you couldn't have observed not C doesn't tell you whether C is evidence for X. It might be that C is evidence for X, but just if not C had happened, you wouldn't have been around to observe it. So I think that's irrelevant. And then if you can come up with these explanations of fine tuning where you invoke a multiverse like a Tegmark multiverse, but I think the worry is that those one of the worries, there are many, is that those have a Boltzmann brain problem.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think there's merit to the Boltzmann brain argument to be like, look, if you contrast what you're observing versus not being a Boltzmann brain, like that's evidence. Like, why are you observing this non-Boltzmann brain version of things? I might be able to answer that by being like, well, what if something about lower entropy universes makes them a priori more likely, right? Because Boltzmann brains are like super high, they only exist in super high entropy universes.
Well, earlier you were saying that the Tegmark version, that you were suggesting the Tegmark view might be right. On the Tegmark view, you definitely don't get any preference for low entropy. If anything, you get a preference for higher entropy.
Yeah.
Because there are just way more.
Okay, you're right. So spitballing here. So what if I take the Tegmark view? Like, all math exists, but the degree to which it exists, or like, the probabilities, are weighted based on the Occam type distribution, Solomon-Off induction type distribution, where the low entropy universes they get more reality fluid, right? They get more observer moments or whatever it is.
Right. So the problem is the number of mathematical structures is too many to be a set, and if you have things that are too many to be a set, then it doesn't give give way nicely towards thinking that like you can't have, there isn't a nice way to say, oh, these things are both too many to be a set, but this one's 9 times larger than this other one. If two infinites,
Well, Solomon-Off induction does kind of solve that problem. Like there's ways to solve that problem that are reasonably elegant.
well, no, there aren't, because there are ways to assign a higher probability to being in worlds based on the worlds being simpler, even if there are an infinite number of both of them. But if there's the same cardinality of infinity, and in this case with the Tegmark view, it's not even a cardinality of infinity. But if there are two things and both of them are too large to be a set, then there isn't a way to say one of them is a little bit bigger than the other one, right? Because they're both too large to it's easier to see this with smaller infinites, ones that aren't too big to be a set. But imagine you tried to have this with the Tegmark view, where you said, okay, there are like Aleph null. You try to have a multiverse, and you said, there are Aleph null simple universes and complicated universes, but there are more of the simple universes than the complex universes. Well, if there are Aleph null of both of them, they could be placed in one-to-one correspondence. In fact, you could match them up so that for every simple universe, you pair it up with 10 complex universes.
Yeah, of course you need a measure, right? You need some way to allocate your 100% probability across all these countably infinite options, right? I mean, that's what Solomon-Off induction does, for instance.
Well, Solomon-Off induction is a way of splitting up your credences across being in different worlds, right? But if the worlds are both actual, then you shouldn't have different credences based purely on one being simpler, unless one of them is more common. And my point is that you can't say one of them is more common because they're infinites of the same size.
Well, I'm just presenting a mental model, how I'm basically saying there's a way that I can take all mathematical structures, maybe not literally all under some definition where there's uncountably infinite, but like it is realistic to be like, look, there's countably infinite mathematical structures that can be specified by a finite description, right? So it's common in math to be like, look, realistically, it's just countably infinite. And if it's countably infinite, I can give a measure over them where the ones that have a short description get more probability and the ones that have a long description get less. Like I can make a prior, right? This is doable.
Right. Okay. So if you, you'll get the same problem if you have only, like, if you have uncountably infinite, you'll get the same problem where there are ways that are perfectly mathematically consistent to get a measure over infinite sets. But the problem is if you have there's not, first of all, it's very hard to get a measure over infinite sets if you're, if you have infinite sets that are of the same cardinality and they're in spatiotemporally disconnected worlds. Like this is a very hard thing to do. Now you can just arbitrarily privilege, say, just for no reason, that it's likelier that you're in a simple world. But then it's hard to see on what basis you think it's likelier that you're in a simple world if there aren't any more of the simple worlds. And it's hard to see how you can say there are more of the simple worlds, because in both cases there are continuum many of them. You can match them up one-to-one with each other. In fact, if you wanted to smush the mathematical structures into one universe, you could have every universe that is simple. Sorry, you could have every complicated universe be matched up with like a million simple universes. This is just the way infinity works, with two infinite sets of the same cardinality.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't really see how what you're saying now, it doesn't also invalidate Solomon-Off induction. It just seems like the argument generalizes too much.
Well, no, it doesn't invalidate Solomon-Off induction, because Solomon-Off induction is about how you assign priors across different worlds. That's very different from if you think both of the worlds are actual and you assign an indifference. So long as you think if two worlds are actual, the odds you're in each of them is equal, then you get a mess when you think that there are infinite worlds. Now, I think there are infinite worlds, but I think God can help with the math regarding infinite worlds. But okay, sorry, that's a separate topic. But But if you don't think all the worlds are equal, then it's perfectly fine to just say, okay, probably we're going to get one of the simpler worlds for Solomon-off induction reasons. But if you think all the worlds are actual, and you try to assign a principle of indifference, then there's not any nice way of saying that the simpler worlds are likely. Because any two worlds that both contain you think it's equally likely are in both of them. Unless you adopt some weird anthropic view, which I think will be very implausible.
Well, yeah, if the two worlds are equally simple, but generally, generally one of them has a higher prior probability. But even if they have a similar prior probability, like so what? Yeah, so I agree. So then I'm like, oh, here's a bunch of different worlds that I might be in. I mean, that's generally where Solomon-off leaves you, right? Is it gives you candidate worlds and you distribute your probability across them.
You're describing a scenario where all these worlds were actual. And so long as you think that if all these worlds are actual, the probability of being in any two worlds that both contain someone with your exact experiences is equal, then you can't.
Yeah. I don't expect to always be able to tell you exactly which world I'm in, right? I'm always carrying around a probability distribution.
But that wasn't what I was saying.
Okay.
What I was saying was that so long as you think that for any two people, so suppose there are two worlds and both of these worlds exist. One of them is a simple world, one of them is a more complicated world, and they both contain a copy of Lyran Shapira. In this case, do you agree that your credence in you being in each of the worlds, assuming they're both compatible with your evidence, should be equal?
Well, the one that's simpler would have been higher, it would have had more a priori probability, so I'm not updating away from it.
We're talking about a scenario where both of the worlds exist.
They both exist, but the simpler one maybe I should repeat that I'm giving you a scenario where all possible worlds exist, but the ones that have a higher Solomon-off induction prior have more reality fluid in them.
What is reality fluid?
It's precisely the concept that I would use when I'm trying to make a probability distribution over which world I'm in.
Okay, well, I don't think reality is.
It's similar to the Born probabilities in quantum theory, right? Like it's a thing that agents do, and they're trying to get by.
Right. So what you want is something that makes it so that you're justified in thinking, so that you can have some coherent, justified way of thinking that you're likelier to be in the simpler worlds. And my point is that if all the worlds are equal, assuming that for any two worlds that are equal, that are both real, you should assign an equal credence in you being in both of them, assuming they both contain someone with your experience. Then you just get undefined.
But that's not what I'm proposing, right? So I'm proposing a way that when I'm trying to reason about which universe I'm in, I'm just using Solomon-off induction and on the prior that I could be in any mathematically possible world, right? This is roughly how I do things, right? And I just don't see what the problem is.
Right. Well, so the problem is this violates. So there's a plausible principle, which is okay. So let's just ignore all the other worlds. Okay. Let's just imagine there are only these two worlds. Okay. There's complicated world that contains a copy of you, and there's a simple world that contains a copy of you, and they're both real worlds. They both exist. You think that you should think yourself likelier to be in the complicated world than the simpler world?
You mean like you're in the simpler world? Yeah.
Sorry. Yeah. Sorry. Other way around.
I do, yeah. And again, this is very much like quantum many worlds, where it's like, if I see there's a quantum coin flip or, 10 in a row or whatever, I think it's more likely that I got, whatever the probability says, right? I'm ultimately going to similarly have a probability distribution over how I'm going to see this quantum randomness turn out. That's just how you got to operate.
Yeah, well, so, I mean, so there is a view that I'm sympathetic to of applying Solomon-off induction or something like it to the probabilities of different worlds existing, right? To saying that the odds of different worlds coming to be are higher, are higher if the worlds are simpler than if they're more complicated, right? This I think is perfectly correct. But there's another thing that you're trying to do, which is saying not only is Solomon-off induction a guide to what state of affairs is likelier to exist, it's also a guide to where I'm likelier to find myself in, what world I'm likelier to find myself in, given that it exists. And that one, I think that's very implausible, right? Okay, so here, let's just imagine, okay, simple case. There are two worlds. Both of them just involve a room with a copy of you. One of them has the number 1 on the door. One of them has a really complicated number that is written in very small font and takes very, very long to write out. So it's much more complicated to describe. Do you think that you should think you're way more likely to be in the room with 1 on the door than the room with a long number on the door?
I mean, it's you're not giving me the full context. Like, I would want a whole model of like the universe that led to the room. So,
No,
because if it's a
the
simpler universe
the
that just had an agent that wrote a complicated number at the
no
end, then maybe
the
I still want to go with
entire
that
the
universe.
entire universe is just a
Okay.
copy of you appears in
Okay.
a
Sure. Sure.
room
Sure. Yeah.
with the door.
Okay. Yeah. Then I would go with the simpler universe having higher probability.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's just that strikes me as substantively very implausible, and I think if you try to, I mean, for people who are interested, the view you're talking about as applied to anthropics is called eudasa, where basically you you favor anthropic theories according to which it's easier to specify not merely the world, but your place in the world. Now, Joe Carlsmith had a very long post that I think completely devastated eudasa, and it had many decisive objections. I mean, so here's one of them, for example. Are you familiar with the Sleeping Beauty problem?
I've heard of it, but I don't remember. But by the way, before we get down this rabbit hole, though, I think we've kind of established that like this is basically my MO. I just try to use Solomon-Off induction. When I see fine-tuned constants, I still use Solomon-Off induction. I think maybe we should just go the other way now and be like, okay, let's do what you do. You conclude there is God, right? Like, let's dive into that.
Well, I mean, so whether in order to see how reasonable it is to conclude that there's God, we have to consider the other options. And to be clear, this is not the only bit of evidence for God. I think there are quite a lot of things that provide evidence for the existence of God. But just I'm a Bayesian, so we look at the fact that the constants are finely tuned. The probability of this, given that God exists and wants to bring about life, is higher than given that God doesn't exist. So it's evidence for the existence of God. Maybe it's not decisive evidence.
So if God didn't exist, how would life ever emerge? Like, under what conditions?
I think it's unlikely that life would exist if God didn't exist.
Okay.
I think the fact that life exists is evidence that God exists.
So life wouldn't exist if God didn't exist. Okay. I think about that.
I at least think it would exist with lower probability than if God did exist.
Right. Okay. So I think maybe the crux of the disagreement is just going to get down into the specification for what you consider God to be. So again, without saying God, right? So like, give me the properties one at a time, right? Like, okay, so it looks like the universe, it's weird. Let's say I agree that it's weird that life exists, right? For whatever reason, I agree this is surprising. I'm trying to explain my surprise. So what principle should I accept right now?
Well, so there was already this hypothesis on the table, which is that there's a perfect being of limitless power, knowledge, and goodness who created the world. Now,
right. Maybe you can give me the properties one at a time, right? Because you can lead me up to it.
Sure. So let's start with limitless in power.
Okay, so because it's surprising that humanities exist, then there's some entity that's limitless in power. Okay.
Well, so this isn't the only reason to think there's an entity that's limitless in power. The argument that moves me the most is an argument called the anthropic argument, which I guess we could talk about, but we've been going for several hours, so maybe not worth opening that can of worms. But
maybe you could just give me the thing that I'm most likely to accept, right? Make it easiest for me to say yes. What part of God will I be nodding along to the most?
Well, I mean, I guess, I mean, there are lots of things about God that you would agree with. But then these things will be trivial, right? So you agree that there's going to be some fundamental thing, right? That's something we'd agree about. But I think this thing is God. The thing that I think we would disagree about is what the properties of the fundamental thing is. So I think that there's a reason to think that the fundamental thing has just one essential property. And this is a very simple hypothesis, which it has the property of being a limitless mind. In my view of ontology, there are three kinds of things. There's the physical world, there's the mental world, there's consciousness, and there are abstract objects like facts about mathematics and morality. So if you take one of these kinds of things and just instantiate it completely without limit, that's a really simple hypothesis, right? It just takes one of the fundamental kinds of things and instantiates it without limit. So if you take a mind and you instantiate it without limit, what would not be limited in what it can do or knows, it would have limitless awareness insofar as it's unlimited. And because it knows every moral fact and it grasps the reasons to follow all the moral facts, it would be motivated to follow the moral fact, right? So there's this widely held thesis, which is that if you recognize that something is desirable, this will cause you to pursue it. You'll want to pursue it, at least unless you have some contrary desire. But in the case of God, he doesn't have any, there's nothing built into his psychology that gives him a contrary desire. So we have this very simple hypothesis, and then this hypothesis makes the presence of fine-tuning much likelier than the alternative, so it's strong evidence for the existence of God.
what if I just have a simpler, compact version of God where it's like, God, there's just this force in the universe that wanted intelligent agents to exist. And so that force just caused laws of physics and parameters that ultimately lead to intelligent agents, did its thing, and then got out of the way and let the laws of physics take it away from there, right? So that's kind of like maybe a minimalistic definition. I don't even think that we need that, but if I just accept that, what am I missing?
Well, if you say there's a force that brought about the laws of physics, if you want to specify, I mean, that's kind of vague. If you want to specify what the force does and what constraints it has.
Sure, it just loves intelligence, right? So it looks ahead. It's asking what's going to get me intelligent agents that can reflect on the universe. Oh, okay, setting these laws and these parameters. Okay, done.
Right.
I've achieved my mission.
So it can set the laws and parameters to any value that it wants. That brings.
Sure, yeah. I'm just saying. I feel like this is like God light over here. That's like doing the job of explaining fine tuning.
Well, I mean, first of all, I think intelligence is a non-fundamental thing. So you're going to get a lot of extra Solomon-off complexity if you build in a desire for intelligence at the fundamental level. And you have to build in, if it has the ability to bring about any state of affairs, then it's pretty simple. But then it's weird that it brings about this world with so few intelligent agents. I guess maybe you could have it bring about like every possible intelligent agent, but then you get, similar Boltzmann brain problems.
Okay, and so the difference between God light and your God is you think that your God is explaining a lot of properties of our universe. Like I think you said I think you think we do live in the best of all possible worlds with the way you explain things.
Well, I don't think this world is the best of all possible worlds, and I don't even think reality as a whole is the best of all. I think God probably makes a giant multiverse, and that this multiverse is the best one he could make. Now, of course, it's not a perfect multi. Like I think we have free will, right? So I think some people mess up. So the world is worse than it could be if we used our free will to do better stuff. But
okay, so maybe I guess just explain I think you think that the multiverse has been optimized, right? And fine tuning is one example of how you think it's optimized. And I think you have a story where you think we're here to like be able to mess up, but like show that we can do good, or like that's kind of what you think is going on right here in this universe.
I mean, that's in response to the problem of evil. So that's a kind of like, that's not something I would say as an argument for the existence of God. That's just a response to one of the arguments against God's existence, which is that God's existence fits poor away with the large amount of evil in our world.
Okay. So basically, can you give me some explanatory power here? Like make this useful to me.
This explains lots of facts about our world, explains the existence of a physical world, explains that there are laws, explains that the laws are applicable to the initial conditions of the universe, explains that the laws are capable of giving rise to complex structures, it explains that there are finely tuned constants, it explains that certain physical arrangements of matter are capable of giving rise to consciousness, it explains the anthropic data that you in particular exist out of the infinite array.
So if I accept everything you said so far, does any of this let me do anything differently? Or anticipate anything differently?
Like you're asking if it makes well, so one prediction it makes is that there's going to be an afterlife with high probability. But in terms of like, can we
does it predict? But what can it tell me about the afterlife?
Well, then it'll be very good, right? Because it's made by a perfect being.
But isn't it also consistent to be like, okay, yeah, God made the universe, but also when you die, you're going to burn in hell? Like, isn't that also a competing hypothesis?
Well, that's consistent, but if you think God is perfect, then it's hard to see why he would cause people to suffer forever if suffering is bad.
I mean, perfect in that sense. I don't think you can derive that just from looking at the constants.
Well, I was explaining earlier where I think... So the hypothesis that there's a limitless mind is a very simple hypothesis, as I was explaining before. And this hypothesis entails perfection, or at least it's not super unlikely that there would be perfection given it. If you don't think it gets perfection, then you have to make the hypothesis way more complicated, because then you have to brutally add in all sorts of other desires. And then this just explains lots of facts about the world. It explains why there's fine-tuning, it explains why there are laws, it explains why there's consciousness, why there's psychophysical harmony.
When you describe perfection, you're making it sound like it's such a simple concept, but I think how does your perfection distinguish humans having like an enjoyable time versus like being ground to dust or having a bad time? Like, how does the word perfection for you, how does a simple concept distinguish that?
Well, What I was saying was the simple concept was a limitless mind. Insofar as the mind is limitless, it would know all the mortal facts. It would thus be motivated to follow.
Right. That's right. So I forgot you have this whole part of your worldview is the ontological fundamentalness of morality. Okay, that makes sense. That's right. So then that becomes the crux, right? So
Maybe that's
we should probably talk about.
If I can sell you on like all I need for theism, maybe you think moral realism's false, but you shouldn't be like massively confident that it's false. There are all these smart people who agree with it who are not theists. So maybe you start thinking, your prior in moral realism's like 10% or something, or in a kind of moral realism where like if you understand all the moral facts and have no contrary psychological motivations, you'd be motivated to follow them. But conditional on that, then here's a hypothesis that's pretty good. There's a limitless mind plus that kind of moral realism, and then it explains the data really well. So you should think, okay, I update from the fact that there are all these things that are surprising under naturalism, and so I end up concluding that probably there is this limitless mind that conjoined with a kind of moral realism where one who grasps all the moral facts and is perfectly rational would be motivated to follow them.
Okay, all right. So now we're going to get into moral realism. So explain your position on moral realism.
So I have this crazy wild view that I think some things are wrong and that this doesn't depend on what people think about them. So for example, suppose you take a baby, you hit them with a hammer. I think you're doing something wrong. I think this fact doesn't depend on what you think about them. Okay, why do I hold this, crazy view that's utterly anathema in less wrong circles?
Right.
So here's a plausible principle. So which I think is the right way to approach epistemology. If something seems right to you, and you don't have a good reason to doubt it, that gives you at least some justification for thinking that it's true. People often don't like this principle, but just think back to how your most basic foundational beliefs are justified. Like, why is it that you think, why is it that you think the world is more than 5 minutes old? Well, okay, maybe your answer is, Solomon off induction says that's a simpler world. Okay, why do you trust that worlds that are better according to Solomon off induction are likelier? At some point, you're going to just ground out on things that you believe because they seem really obvious. So insofar as you buy things that you have gained justification for thinking things are true because they seem obvious, well, the hypothesis that some things are wrong and this fact doesn't depend on what we think about them, that seems really obvious. It's a view that seems to be believed by nearly everyone. And when you just think about like seriously morally wrong acts and ask, okay, is, the thing that makes torture wrong? Number one, is torture wrong? Seems like it is. Number two, is the thing that makes it wrong what anyone thinks about it? It seems like the answer is no. Like, even if everyone in the world agreed torture was great, as long as that wouldn't affect whether torture is bad, it's still a wrong thing to do. So if we accept this, we accept that things are wrong and they don't depend on your attitudes, and we accept that the fact that something seems right to you gives you justification for thinking that it is right, then we have to think that moral realism is true.
Okay, so just to clarify, you think that morality is literally universal, as in with respect to the universe, whereas I think morality is a near human universal, right? With respect to the human species and maybe similar species, but not literally the whole universe and not all intelligent agents. Do you think that's a good summary of where we disagree?
I don't think the right way of thinking about it is universal. Like if we ask, it depends on exactly what you mean by universal. I think morality is, the moral facts are true all the way throughout the universe, right? So if we were in Alpha Centauri, it would still be wrong to torture babies. And if there was an alien species that thought that like rape and torture were great, I think they'd be in error. So in that, I think it's analogous to like mathematics, where mathematics, the mathematical facts aren't facts about the universe. They are, in some sense, true all the way throughout the universe.
I see. So you think that on the level of epistemology or perhaps ontology, you think there's such a thing as a moral fact, and what you and I, with our human brains, what we believe is good, it happens to dovetail very nicely with these moral facts, and you can imagine other intelligent brains that are convinced of what they like and what they think is good, but you can imagine that wouldn't dovetail with moral facts, correct?
That's right.
Okay. So that's my first question for you, is basically, do you believe in what I call the weak orthogonality thesis, which I would state as follows: within the space of possible algorithms, you could have a super intelligent algorithm, an AI that's much smarter than Einstein, and yet is firmly committed to the value that the more humans you kill, the better. Is that a possible algorithm that exists in algorithm space?
Yep.
Okay, so it is. So your only objection would be that, yes, such an AI could kill us and take over the world, but it would be contradicting the morally real fact that killing people is bad in your view.
Yeah, it would be doing something immoral. Like you could have, and this is the AI, I assume, would be ignorant of the moral facts. I guess maybe it could know the moral facts, but not be motivated by them. But like, yeah, you could have a super intelligent person who either is ignorant of some facts or who doesn't care about some facts. Really true with lots of facts.
Got it. Now, in your view, it seems like a happy coincidence that you and I both don't want to go kill babies, right? Even if we wouldn't get arrested for it, we don't want to do it. Why do you think that what most humans want to do is so nicely correlated to moral realism?
Well, I think that we're rational agents who are capable of grasping morality, so we can see that some things are wrong. It's no more mysterious than that our mathematical beliefs are mostly right. As these rational creatures who can reflect, we can see that certain things about math are true, like that there are infinite prime numbers.
Okay, that's interesting. So you accepted my weak form of the orthogonality thesis, but it sounds like you wouldn't accept the strong form of the orthogonality thesis, which is that even though these smart, immoral agents exist in algorithm space, you probably think that they're unlikely to actually emerge, right? Like if we have a program of like recursive self-improvement of some AIs that we don't know how to align well, we just let them self-improve. In your view, just by virtue of getting smarter, they'll probably realize these moral facts. And so even though technically they could want to kill humans, they probably won't because they'll realize the moral fact that killing humans is bad. Is this basically your worldview?
I don't know. I mean, certainly, I don't think this is a decisive argument against AI risk because it's not super obvious that the AI would figure this out. Like, I think maybe you need to be conscious or something to figure these facts out. And I mean, well, you don't need to be, but maybe this is sort of like the thing that establishes a default for figuring it out. And it's not super obvious that the AIs would be conscious or that they would be the sorts of things that could grasp the moral facts. Like you could imagine all sorts of creatures that are smart in lots of ways, but that are ignorant of the moral facts. It's not obvious that just making a creature smart always makes it aware of the moral facts. Just like you could imagine a creature that, the super intelligent AI, you could imagine either, not knowing that there are infinite prime numbers, or maybe knowing that there are infinite prime numbers, but just not caring about that.
Right. Okay. So I guess let me just more directly then ask you the question about AI doom, which is if we don't have a lot of insight into how to align an AI, and we just kick off a process where the AI gets smarter, does that feel like it'll work well or badly to you?
I think I would have a higher credence in it working well than probably most. I think there's some chance that basically the AI gets super smart, figures out the Platonic moral facts, and then acts nicely. But I don't think that's that likely. So maybe I'd give it 40% probability or 30-ish or something that it would work out okay.
So yeah, interesting. So in my language, it sounds like you fully embrace the weak orthogonality thesis in terms of what algorithms could do if you get the right bits configured. But you're somewhat skeptical about the strong orthogonality thesis, which says that you make an agent intelligent and they're not going to bend toward morality. In your mind, no, you're yeah, they very well might bend toward morality, right? So you're not convinced about the strong orthogonality thesis that they'll just keep going in whatever unaligned direction they started with.
Yeah, I think they probably will, but I'm not certain of that.
Got it. Okay. Well, I think now it's finally time to ask you the big question. Are you ready?
Yeah, hit it.
P-Doom, what's your P-Doom, what's your P-Doom, what's your P-Doom?
Matthew, Bentham's Bulldog, what is your P-Doom?
A few percent, maybe 2, around 2%.
Okay. And it sounds like what you think about the strong orthogonality thesis, where you do kind of suspect that smart agents bend toward universal morality. It sounds like that belief is lowering your P-Doom, correct?
I think maybe they do. But yeah, I guess that lowers my P-Doom a little bit.
Would you sign the statement on AI risk that says, mitigating the risk of extinction from AI should be a global priority alongside other societal scale risks such as pandemics and nuclear war?
Yes.
Okay, fair enough. I agree. That's a good statement. I think it should be unobjectionable. Getting back to moral realism, you kind of made a testable prediction, which is that you're rejecting the strong orthogonality thesis. So you made this super optimistic prediction. I hope you're right, though I doubt it, which is we're going to see AIs independently bending toward higher morality. Besides that, is there some prediction that we can test today, maybe before the singularity, to verify if moral realism is true?
Well, sorry, just to be clear, my claim is that I think AIs might do that, but probably won't. Grasp and be motivated by the moral truth. Because, it's a sort of weird thing to be motivated by. I think the reasoning behind why you should follow, like, if AIs are just these complicated machines maximizing utility function, they're not going to be motivated by the moral facts. But it becomes unclear exactly how the AI's mind is going to work. Right, so I have some credence in it working out when the AI grasps the moral facts, but I think maybe a bit one.
Short of waiting for AIs to get super intelligent and watching what they do, what kind of prediction can we make today?
I don't know that it makes much of a prediction. I mean, there are certain predictions that if moral realism is true, that raises the likelihood that lots of smart philosophers will think it's true. So that's one thing it retrodicts. But in terms of true things that experimental tests of it, unfortunately, I don't think there's much we can do. Just this is true of lots of things. We can't really, if we want to figure out, there's no experimental test that can tell us distinguish between the hypothesis the world was made 5 minutes ago looking old and the world is genuinely old. But nonetheless, one of those, we can be reasonably confident that one of those is right.
What if we woke up tomorrow and suddenly we were living in a universe where the moral reality is that killing babies is good? What would change?
Well, I don't think that's a possible scenario, because I think the moral facts are necessary. So that's like asking, what if we woke up tomorrow and 7 was a composite number?
Well, one thing you mentioned is that it's the truth of moral realism is correlated to philosophers writing about it. So maybe tomorrow all the philosophers renounce moral realism. So what else would be left in the universe to let you distinguish that moral realism had stopped being true?
Right. Well, so okay. If the question is what things are explained by the truth of moral realism, I think one of the reasons why so many philosophers think moral realism is right and why lots of people have various moral judgments is that the moral judgments are true. So in a world where none of those things would happen, then your credence in moral realism should be lower. It doesn't make sense to talk about okay, what happened if we woke up tomorrow and moral realism was false? Because moral realism is either necessary or impossible. It's either true in all possible worlds or none of them. So it's not the sort of thing that might change over time, just like whether 7 is a prime number isn't the sort of thing that might change over time.
And what makes you think that it's true?
Well, the argument I was giving before, that the way we should have a basic trust in our seemings, and it seems really obvious that moral realism is right. It seems
got it. So what if you wake up tomorrow and you're suddenly the only one who's saying this, right? Like everybody else is saying nope, killing babies is good, and it's just you now. So what do you make of that?
So I guess if everyone else in the world thought that torturing babies was fine, maybe at that point, maybe I should think that I'm sort of like a schizophrenic or something, where I'm just insane.
Or similarly, I mean, what if all the AIs, right? What if the AIs are like, hey, humanity, I'm sorry, you guys are so obsessed with letting yourselves live, but actually we've decided it's better to just have you guys die, and we have other ideas for the universe. If the AIs told us that, would you be like, okay, they've got a point?
Well, I actually think maybe, a world where AIs kill us, assuming they bring about certain things of enough value, that might be a better world. But if the AIs had really implausible substantive judgments, you program the AIs to love paper clips, and then the AIs are like, oh, turns out we think it's better for you to be replaced with paper clips. I'd say, AIs, I think you're in error, because I think we can tell this debunking account of how the AIs got their beliefs, where, the AIs were built with a utility function that makes it so that that they were maximizing something. So it's no surprise they think that thing's good.
Okay, so you think that there's an objective truth about what's good. Do you think that you fully know that truth, or you only know part of it, or how much of it do you know?
I think I probably my beliefs at what's good correlate with what's good. I probably don't have I'm probably my moral beliefs don't perfectly track the truth, just like I think there are facts of the matter about what's possible and what's necessary. I don't think my beliefs about it perfectly track. Hopefully they roughly track it. Or similarly, my beliefs about mathematics, hopefully mostly right, but they don't perfectly track the mathematical facts.
Okay, but how do you know when they're getting closer versus farther from the moral truth?
You do moral philosophy. You reason about it. You give arguments about why some otherwise plausible moral judgment conflicts with some other moral judgments, and so thus we should abandon it. It's just, basically the same
But
way
I
we
think
do other
by
sorts of
your own
philosophical
logic, right?
inquiry.
You have super intelligent algorithms that are really good at reasoning in the sense of like being effective and getting stuff done, and they are just like not productive at moral philosophy, right? So like, how do you know that you're doing moral philosophy right?
Well, wait. The first part of your sentence, like I didn't.
The connection I'm making is that you can have super intelligent minds that, by your hypothetical, are just like incompetent at moral philosophy despite being super intelligent. So when you attempt moral philosophy, how do you know that you're doing the right version of moral philosophy?
Well, I don't know. I mean, it's possible that we're all completely misled about it, but you think hard about it. You consider the evaluations of other smart people. It's the same way that, yeah, maybe all of our judgments about mathematics are wrong, but nonetheless, I don't think that's very likely.
So with mathematics, you start with assumptions where you're allowed to just lay down any axioms, and then you can just prove that you're deriving things that follow from the axioms. So that is a pretty easy answer to the question of how do I know I'm doing mathematics right? It's like, okay, did you invent axioms? Did you just reason about their implications? Great, you're doing mathematics right. What would you say similarly about moral philosophy?
Well, I don't think that's the right way of thinking about mathematics, where mathematics is about just proving truths from axioms, because, you know, this was a view that used to be common among mathematicians and philosophers of math, and is no longer, because basically Gödel's incompleteness theorem means that a system of axioms will either be inconsistent or incomplete. So it won't be the case.
Yeah, so we generally just accept that they're incomplete, but that still makes math interesting.
But then it won't be that math is just proving things from axioms, because there are going to be true mathematical claims that you can't prove from the axioms.
Yeah, it's doing your best to prove them for axioms.
But it can't be that a mathematical truth is just something that follows from the axioms, because there are mathematical truths that don't follow from the axioms.
Whenever there's a mathematical truth that doesn't follow from the axioms, it's because you refer to another outer axiom system that it does follow from.
Well, but even with that outer axiom system, it won't. There are going to be some things that are true about math where that won't follow.
Well, if it's worth pointing them out, then you can point them out in a larger axiom system. Otherwise, you can ignore it.
But there can be lots of mathematical truths that are not very important, and so it isn't enough to just say all the mathematical truths are ones that follow from axioms. Because no matter how many axioms you have...
But you get to make up your own axioms too, right? I'm just saying, you basically ask, like, how do we know how to do math? How do we know it's correct? I just told you, like, I don't have a problem distinguishing whether somebody's doing math or not, but I feel like we do have a problem distinguishing if somebody's doing real moral philosophy or not.
Well, so it could be that all the mathematicians are, like, mistaken about how to prove things or something. Maybe...
Okay, but that seems like shaky territory, like asserting that we have no idea how to prove things. I feel like we do.
Well,
right?
okay,
But then with moral philosophy...
here's a more analogous case. So, you're a big fan of Kolmogorov, what's the kind of complexity you like to figure?
I like Kolmogorov complexity. I like complexity theory, computational complexity.
Yeah, right. And so you think that the way we figure out our priors across worlds is by applying Kolmogorov complexity.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So how do you know that? I mean, it could be that UNLA.
Oh yeah. No, I don't know that. It's just the ideal of a reasoning algorithm. That if I could approximate that ideal, then I would get really powerful reasoning results. Like I would get a hypothesis that is very likely to have, or actually is provably likely to have the highest possible predictive power. It's uncomputable to get there, but if I could approximate it, then that would be powerful.
Right. But I mean, you would say that. Well, so whether it's the highest predictive power, like this, it depends on what the right priors are, right? So if the right priors are just like, any world is equally likely, simpler worlds are no more likely than complex worlds. Well, then you shouldn't have any preference in assigning your priors in favor of thinking that the world is likelier to be simple.
Okay, well, I feel like we're getting off on a tangent here. Like I was just asking you, like, you admitted that you don't have perfect access to the moral truth. And then I just asked you, okay, well, by what methodology does one get better access to moral truth? And you said, well, we do that. There's the field of moral philosophy, but I just don't know the rules of the field compared to the rules of math.
You consider the arguments, you discuss them with other people who are intelligent. This is the way that in any other case where you have foundational beliefs that you're not deriving them from other things, you get the same worry of how you get those beliefs. Like, if we want to know how is it that we're justified in thinking that the world is more than 5 minutes old, you could imagine all sorts of minds who don't think that. You could imagine all sorts of AGIs who think that the world is only 5 minutes old. And,
well, I have, by the way, I have like a non-zero probability that the world is only 5 minutes old.
Yeah,
right?
I have a non-zero probability. But yeah. I mean, I assume you have a low probability that the world is less than 5 minutes old.
Right. So we have a methodology. Like, the methodology of science is an approximation of Solomon-Off induction. Right? That's the correct way to do science. So what is the methodology of morality?
Well, the methodology of morality is you reflect on the moral principles. You see if they seem plausible. You consider reasons to accept and to reject them. And then you come to judgments about them.
So it sounds to me like if you're admitting that that's the methodology, you're implying that it's a property of the brain, because a different brain would come to the conclusion differently.
Well, no. You're asking about the methodology of how we figure out what's morally true. That will involve our brain. But the moral truths themselves don't depend on our brain. So an analogy is the way that...
But if the department was staffed with AIs, they would reach a...
Sorry, let me finish the sentence. The methodology for figuring out if there's a table in front of me is I look and I see if there's a table, and then maybe I ask other people, do you see a table? That doesn't mean that the table
depends on your brain working properly at seeing.
My knowledge of the table depends on my brain working properly, but the table existing doesn't depend on it. Similarly, my knowledge of morality depends on my brain. Obviously, if I didn't have a brain, I wouldn't know anything. But my brain, but the moral facts themselves don't depend on my brain.
Got it. So the difference here is you can imagine a department full of AIs looking at the table being like, there is no table here. And they all agree that there's no table. But the problem is that what their brains are doing, they have some methodology, but they're violating the methodology of Solomon-Off induction. So they're basically just like bad scientists. But they're going to get punished for that eventually, right? Like, they're going to have like bad theories.
Right. But the question is why we should trust the methodology of Solomon-Off induction, right? So if you want to justify the belief that the world is more than 5 minutes old with high credence, you could imagine all sorts of super intelligent AI who think the world is only 5 minutes old and have a different way of assigning credences than the way that you do. But that doesn't tell you anything about whether your credences are justified. The fact that you can imagine minds that disagree with you about things doesn't tell you anything about whether those things are justified.
Right, but I mean, I think you see the difference I'm going for between a science department and a moral philosophy department, which is the science department, it has a feedback loop. Like, agents that aren't approximating Solomon-Off induction, like they're ultimately going to get outcompeted by agents that get
look, if you have two agents, one of them is applying Solomon-Off induction, the other one is applying something like Solomon-Off induction, in many cases, right, so that in terms of making predictions about the future, but in terms of their judgments about the past, they don't think superior worlds are more likely, and so they have a high prior and think the world is 5 minutes old. They'll end up with a posterior of thinking the world is 5 minutes old. And so in order, your judgment that that's justified, the methodology you're using is just going to be like reflecting on your intuitions and thinking, that doesn't seem plausible. It seems like Solomon-Off induction is a good guide across the board. And then that's also my methodology. You rely on your intuitions.
Okay, but Solomon-Off induction has optimality properties in a way that moral philosophy doesn't.
Well, so explain what you mean when you say it has optimality properties.
Yeah, so the thing about Solomon-Off induction is it always gets you the theory that best explains the evidence you have. It always gets you the theory that would have given the highest probability to the evidence you're seeing, and also is as simple as possible.
Well, I mean, this isn't true. If the evidence that you have is that your present experiences, in order to say that that Solomon-Off induction makes that most likely, you have to say that a simpler world is likelier than a world where, like, you have to think that a world where that's more than 5 minutes old actually is likelier than one where your brain fizzes into existence 5 minutes ago with false memories.
Yes, but now there's also a counting argument that basically says a version of Solomon-Off induction where you try to make really complex worlds start out more likely. It's just you can't fit. There's too many complex worlds. So at some point you have to just give up and be like, okay, fine. Simpler worlds need to have a higher a priori probability.
Well, okay. I mean, there are all sorts of exotic ways you could modify Solomon-Off induction, right? So here's a perfectly consistent way you could assign priors. You could say Solomon-Off induction is right for evaluating all priors except the prior that the world was made 5 minutes old. And that one you should start with a prior of 0.8.
Yeah, of course. But the thing about Solomon-Off induction is when you make that kind of move, it's really obvious you're shooting yourself in the foot, right? Now let's do the equivalent with moral philosophy,
yes,
right? Let's
obviously,
have the same.
Yes, if you have a view that explicitly builds in not being Solomon-Off induction, it will go against Solomon-Off induction. The question is, on what basis do you think Solomon-Off induction is reasonable, and that one is unreasonable without relying on any substantive claim about the reliability of your intuitions?
Well, I mean, yeah. So when you basically said, hey, I have a version of Solomon-Off induction where I just take the conclusion I want and hard code it into my methodology, I think we both know that's not what a methodology looks like. That's oriented toward letting any agent improve itself. That's just, you just told me right now what you want, right?
Whether it's a good way of allowing an agent to improve itself will depend on what the substantively reasonable priors are. If it really is the case that the world is very likely to contain, a Boltzmann version of me, well then, the right way for an agent to reason about that is to assign a high prior to that.
Yeah, I agree. Although the Solomon-Off induction version, even if you are in fact a Boltzmann brain, and you just know that a priori as a precondition to this thought experiment, then yes, you can beat me to figuring that out. But even I, as a Solomon-Off inductor, will get there pretty quick.
Yeah, you'll get it decently quickly. That's right. Yeah, no, Solomon-Off induction will generally get you decently close to the right answer. Of course.
I mean, that's the thing. Like, it does well in literally any scenario.
Okay, but whether or not, so how valuable doing well in any scenario is will depend on what your priors are across the scenarios, right? So if you have an agent, if the world starts out with a 95% chance of just containing having been made 5 minutes old, then that's what your prior should be. There are some priors that are substantively reasonable. You're saying that the Solomon-Off priors are substantively reasonable, but there's not, and I agree with that. Like I think the right methodology is roughly.
It does pretty well in literally every possible world. It's like, yeah, it'll take a few extra updates, right? It'll be a little bit slow, but it's a very respectable performance across the entire distribution of universes.
That isn't true. If the world was made 5 minutes old, if the world is 5 minutes old, Solomon-Off induction never updates you towards thinking that the world is 5 minutes old. If the world was made 5 minutes ago, looking old. It never gets you.
But if it's literally indistinguishable, then I don't even think it's necessarily a valuable exercise to have a methodology that'll help you figure out which is which. If it literally never matters, if it has no causal connection to anything that's going to happen.
Well, I mean, I guess we could imagine a scenario where it came up. We could imagine, that you had to make a bet or something on whether or not the world was more than 5 minutes old. But if the world is more than 5 minutes old, then it makes sense to believe that.
Okay, all right. So you're coming at me for Solomon-Off induction because you want to just show how, like, basically even this ultimate methodology, which I think has rightly earned like a high respect, but you're basically saying, no, I can shoot down any methodology, so that when we come to talk about moral philosophy, the fact that you can easily shoot down my moral philosophy, that doesn't even matter because I can shoot down anything. I feel like that's kind of where this is going.
That's not okay. That's very far from what I was saying. What I was saying was that the methodology that I take when I do moral philosophy is you sort of think hard about things and you rely on your moral intuitions. And my claim is that if you think this methodology is in some way suspect, then you're in basically complete skepticism land because you can't justify anything, right? And so,
but when you say rely on my moral intuitions, this is the key. You really think that your brain got created with the right moral intuitions, right? Like and if it didn't, then you're screwed in terms of getting to the right morality.
Right. Well, but I don't think that the intuitions that your brain has are like these purely random things. Just like I don't think, with your mathematical judgments, they're purely random. Here's the point with Solomon-Off induction. If your brain got made assigning ridiculous priors to things, if in fact the substantively reasonable prior is to assign a prior of 0.999999 to the world being 5 minutes old and being made to look old, then you're screwed with regard to assigning priors to things. it's always possible. Like if your judgments are wrong, it's always possible that you'll be wildly off about the world. But insofar as you think we're rational agents, we can figure out if we're wrong about the world. Our intuitions are not just random shots in the dark.
I have a methodology that can take the majority of situations and point the reasoning toward the correct conclusion. Even if I start out wrong, I start out with a 0.001% probability of the right answer. Give me a few updates, I will get there. I'll get to a high probability of the right answer.
You won't always get
so
there.
I have like a robust methodology.
You won't always get there. If you start out thinking that the world is old, and in fact the world was made 5 minutes ago with you hallucinating, you won't actually get towards ever thinking that the world is young. You won't ever update to have the
but
right
that's
belief.
only because the two are causally indistinguishable, right? So there's by definition or by assumption here, there's just no way that the difference is meaningful in our world.
Okay, but the right theopistemology will say that you should have low credence in the world being 5 minutes old. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I do agree with it, which is
Okay,
why
so
you're
long as you
asking
agree
me
with
a
that-
hypothetical that's just contrived, right? So of course you're basically saying, hey, what if you're wrong? Then what happens? Okay, then I'm wrong, right? You're super contrived with this hypothetical.
It's the same thing. It's the same thing with a moral case. In both cases, we have intuitions, and these intuitions are informing our credences and different views. And our intuitions might be wrong, in which case we'd be wildly off. But we should just think the odds that they're wrong are fairly low.
So the difference here is, you're just throwing at me a curveball where you're just purposely designed to find the weakest part of solid enough induction, which isn't even that weak. Whereas in my case, I don't think it's a curveball to be like, hey, what if your brain wasn't created in correspondence with moral reality?
Well, insofar as, it's always possible that your brain wasn't created in correspondence with any kind of reality. If you're the kind of creature that can think through things and reflect, then you can see, okay, my initial moral judgments were wrong, but upon reflecting, you come to see what the right moral judgment is. The point I'm making about, it's not specific to solid enough induction. It's just it's a basic point of logic that your beliefs will have to come from one of three sources, assuming you think you have any beliefs that are justified. Either you'll have to think there are some beliefs that are basically justified that you don't derive from other beliefs, or your chain of justification will have to be in a circle, or you'll have to think that you have an infinitely long chain of justification, right? So this is just a fact of logic, okay? So whatever your foundational beliefs are, so I don't know which of those you opt for. I don't think if your beliefs are in a circle.
It's an interesting question, because when we look at solid enough induction, how am I justifying solid enough induction? I'm saying it is optimal in most situations. So is that a circular judgment?
Well, okay, how do you know that it's optimal in most situations?
It's mathematically provable.
Well, and how do you know that the mathematical axioms you're relying on are true? You can keep asking how you know this stuff.
So, I guess, right, it's like, how are we talking? Okay, so I think it bottoms out at, our ability to do modus ponens, right? I agree that you can never argue why I think modus ponens make sense logically. Yeah, sure.
Okay, well, why do maybe your brain was made, your brain could be made to mistakenly believe that modus ponens is correct.
Yes. No, I agree. So then the only thing I would appeal to is it does seem like, so that does seem to be convergent, right? I don't think that there's an orthogonality thesis with respect to logic and science. I think that, every different organism has an eye that does in fact tell the brain where things are located, right? They've all converged on that behavior. That is the one convergent behaviors for the eye to actually work well, right? Compared to morality, where you do have animals that will eat their young or not care about each other or hurt each other, right?
Well,
there's
but
no
I don't
convergence
think
on the
those
morality
creatures
front.
there are an infinite number of creatures you could imagine that are relatively intelligent who don't think modus ponens is valid, right? You could imagine,
Yes, that is true. And I believe in the weak orthogonality, the very weak orthogonality thesis for logic. I completely agree, but I think it has to be very weak, right? Because I don't believe in, the moment you actually, or actually, you know what? Let me take that back. I don't think that I take it back, because orthogonality is asserting the orthogonality of intelligence with morality. I don't think intelligence is orthogonal to logic. I think you never get intelligent if you can't grasp these logical structures.
well, okay. You could imagine a super intelligent AGI who thinks that basically the laws of logic hold in our world but are contingent.
I don't know about that, right? Because the definition of logic is that it holds in all worlds.
Well, you could have an AGI that doesn't think that that's true, but thinks that AI.
Sure. Look, there's
you
possible
can't
to
establish a
construct-
substantive claim just by building it into the definition.
It's true that you can have an AI that compartmentalizes a bunch of craziness while still being effective, right? But that's kind of cheating in terms of like, that's not really orthogonality.
Well, that's what I think is true about the AI who has morally crazy beliefs. They've compartmentalized their craziness, but are still relatively effective.
Right. So I think, but let me go back to the original question, which is just like, you are, when you talk about your own methodology to do moral philosophy, you're building in the assumption that your brain, unlike animal brains, right? Because animals are happy to kill each other, for example, your brain started off having a better correspondence to moral reality than these animals. And if you're wrong on that assumption, then your methodology is going to fail.
Well, I also think my brain has a better grasp of mathematical truths and of logical truths. I think that my brain is more able to identify that Solomon-Off induction is a good way of assigning priors than animals.
That's true. And it is very possible that we happen to be the one moral species and the other ones aren't. But I'm just identifying, like, this is just an assumption that isn't exactly rock solid here, right?
Well, I don't think it's not exactly rock solid. I think there's a core difference between us and animals, which is that we are smart and able to figure things out. So I don't think our moral intuitions are just these, like, totally random things that are placed into us by evolution. I mean, I think, obviously, I think the story of how we get our moral beliefs, is going to involve evolution. But I think that just as the process of us grasping mathematical facts doesn't involve the mathematical facts just being completely random and it being lucky that we got the right ones, I think similarly, we have the ability as rational and smart creatures to grasp the moral facts.
Great.
We have the ability to see that certain things about morality are true. And part of the explanation of why we see them as true is that they are in fact true.
Okay, so I have a thought experiment for you. So imagine we have an AI, it's unaligned. We just keep evolving the AI to be like, hey, your goal is to maximize money, your loss function, right? Like the more money you make, then the more reward you get, right? So it just becomes this hyper money optimizer, and then it starts recursively self-improving. Now, in your view, should it go figure out that killing people is bad? Like, at what point does it figure that out, or does it just never figure that out?
Well, as I said before, I don't know if it would figure it out.
But wouldn't it figure out math and science, right? These are things that I feel like everybody figures out. Even agents that just want money, you still figure out math and science. So why do you not figure out morality? Where's the disconnect?
There are lots of things that the AI could have all sorts of beliefs about. Probably it would mimic the beliefs of humans, right? If it's being built on a human corpus of text.
Maybe initially, right? But its actions start to get dominated on just whatever makes the most money.
Okay, right. So it becomes a money maxer.
Yeah.
Right. So like you could imagine an AI that's like this that has all sorts of mistaken beliefs, right? So you could imagine an AI that's like this, but that thinks the world is 5 minutes old and that is very effective at making money. The fact that you can imagine an AI that does this and has various errors, this doesn't tell us about whether the errors are right.
Yeah. So I claim that the AI will figure out that the Earth is billions of years old because it will just generally be good at reasoning, right? Like, I mean, the vast majority of rich humans today can tell you how old the Earth is, and there's a reason for that, right? Like, being smart, these things tend to be connected, right? Like, if you're capable of knowing which stat in which encyclopedia tells you how old the Earth is, you're probably also better at being rich.
It'll depend on what the procedure is for generating the AI. If the procedure for generating the AI is to, like, pick an AI completely at random, well, actually, there are infinite AIs, infinite conceivable AIs, both that think that the world is old and that think that the world is young. You could have an AI that thinks the world is 5 minutes old, or 2.5 minutes old, or 1.25 minutes old, and so on. If we just look at what we think is most probable to happen with, like, real AIs that are maximizing some goal, well, if the thing they're doing all day is making money, I don't expect them to be, like, grokking truths of moral philosophy, where, like, I don't know, there's some truths that the AI probably wouldn't know. If what the AI is doing is all day is making money, I don't know the AI would have anything very useful to say about whether the law of non-contradiction holds absolutely and always, or whether there are weird exceptions like the liar's paradox. The AI could be very smart, and I don't know that the AI would figure this out. It's just not what the AI is going to be doing. Like, I think that I think the AI is probably not going to intelligently be answering most philosophical questions if you just program it and make it smart at achieving some goal, it's probably not going to tell you anything very useful about decision theory. This is not the thing it's thinking about.
Okay, so I guess my question for you then is just, do you see some sort of interrelatedness if the AI becomes richer than any human? Doesn't that at least tell you that, okay, maybe it can't tell you about the law of non-contradiction because that's super philosophical. Maybe that's a little bit beyond its domain. But don't you think that its domain would extend quite wide? So for instance, maybe it's never gotten into the real estate industry before or construction. But if you give it a construction job, don't you think it's probably going to do well with it because it's just just by virtue of getting rich, there's like all these interrelated skills and abilities and smarts that they do kind of all merge.
Yep, there are lots of skills it'll have. There are lots of skills that it won't have. I think figuring out the moral facts is going to be one of the skills it won't have, just like figuring out whether the law of non-contradiction is true, figuring out whether modus ponens hold necessarily always or is contingent. And the reason why the AI won't necessarily figure these things out is that these things are, in your words, super philosophical.
So it's not just that the skills are related to each other, it's also that they have a feedback loop. So if you're doing philosophy wrong, like what you even gave an example, right? You said, hey, if you think everything has to be true or false, you're going to get a statement that stumps you because it's paradoxical. Okay, but the AI can experience that feedback loop and then go back and fix its philosophy, right? Whereas if it thinks killing babies is right, where's the feedback loop? Why doesn't it just continue killing babies? How does it fix itself?
Well, how does the AI fix itself if it thinks that the liar's paradox is a genuine exception to the law of non-contradiction?
Just by virtue of telling it the liar's paradox, it'll be like, okay, you're right. Something is hinky about the law of the excluded middle. Fine. And then maybe one day it'll come up with the way that humans fix it, right? Whereas, yeah, like Gödel's theorem.
So if you think maybe the AI will come up with, will eventually discover why the liar's paradox is not a counterexample to the law of non-contradiction, if you think it'll eventually discover all the modal facts, where like it'll discover that, say, contradictions are not merely non-actual but are impossible, do you think that the AI will discover the right view of decision theory? It'll discover the right view of time, all these, it'll discover whether God exists. Then I think
what I'm saying is it could, right? So somebody could present it with feedback is what I'm saying, right? And it has the methodology to be properly responsive to the feedback. Whereas in morality, what's the feedback?
Well, what's the methodology? When you say the methodology to be highly responsible for the feedback, what is that for the modal case? What is the methodology and the feedback that allows the AI to rule out that the law of non-contradiction is violated in other worlds?
Can we do an example of that? The law of non-contradiction violated in other worlds.
Right. So you might think that like the law of non-contradiction is this sort of contingent thing, relatively like the laws of physics. But in other worlds, like throughout the multiverse, it's at least possible on this picture that there would be some contradictions there, that there would be, say, married bachelors.
I mean, I don't necessarily accept the sense in which that's possible.
Why I don't think it is possible either.
Okay.
But how does the AI figure out that that's impossible?
I think the AI figures out, as we do, that logic is this really useful tool that lets you jump to the implications of things.
But figuring out that something is a useful tool doesn't tell you whether the thing is the rules of it necessarily hold, or whether they hold contingently.
Okay, so
the law of non-contradiction is just as useful if it holds in all possible worlds as if it just holds in some possible worlds.
Right. So again, my question is just, what is the feedback loop that lets it get better at something? So I claim that it'll be as good at logic and science as one could possibly be to be effective in our world, and not necessarily better than that. Right. So where does my claim break down here?
Wait, you're saying it would be as effective at logic and science as it needs to be effective in our world? That's the claim?
Right. I'm saying to the degree that being good at logic and science help you in our world, it's going to figure out how to be good at those things. And there are feedback loops that teach it more about logic and science, right? That exist in our world.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Okay, and I don't think that's true about morality, right? I think it could have, by your definition, the wrong morality and just never have a corrective feedback loop.
Okay. And it can also do that with the modal facts, by thinking that married bachelors are possible in other worlds. There would be no feedback loop if it's wrong about that.
Okay, but that statement will never have a causal connection to our world. So who cares?
Well, it'll never have whether or not even if there's a counterexample is a counterexample, even if it's one you don't care about.
Okay, fine, right? So I agree that when we deal with the magisterium of statements that have zero connection to our world, I agree that maybe the AI will be getting those wrong. Fine.
Well, I mean, there are some that, like whether the world is, well, okay, let's see. I mean, I guess with the moral facts, so I mean, once you've agreed that there are cases where the AI gets it wrong, even though, where the AI gets it wrong by, it has a decent chance of getting it wrong, even though the AI is super smart, then it's hard to see why you think the moral case isn't like that, particularly because the moral facts are like the modal facts, not facts about our physical world. They're not facts that take up space or that will stop the AI from doing something. They're not facts that have any physical instantiation.
Yeah. Well, wait. So aren't you just saying it might just get them permanently wrong, just like it gets other useless facts wrong? So do we both agree that they're just treated as if they're useless facts?
Yeah, the AI might get those facts wrong. Well, I mean, I don't know that the facts are useless. Maybe the facts are ones
but I think I feel like
I don't care about. There's certainly ones that I care about and they're relevant to philosophy, but...
Okay, but remember, my claim is that you seem to imply that, or your original claim was that morality should have the same epistemological status as math, right? That's kind of your definition of moral realism. But I'm just explaining to you
it's not the definition of moral realism. It's a claim I made about it. But...
Okay. I'm just telling you how, to the degree that parts of math and science have a causal connection to our world, they also have feedback loops so that any intelligence has a methodology to get better at those things. Whereas with morality, there's no feedback loop. The part of morality that's relevant to our world, there's no feedback loop to get better at it.
I mean, I feel like at this point I would just be repeating myself, where
I'm confused about the last thing you said, where you're like, hey, look, there's parts that aren't connected to our world. What? I don't get how you're pushing back against the claim.
I think the AGI would by default know the stuff about our physical world, right? And maybe it would know some things that learning the stuff about our physical world would generalize to allow it to figure out. It wouldn't necessarily know all sorts of abstruse philosophical questions. I don't know if the AI would know if A theory versus B theory is right, or whether the modal facts are right, or whether modus tones
but use the example of killing babies, right? That's not abstruse. It really is going to be in a position where it can kill the baby or not.
But whether or not killing babies is wrong is not a fact about the physical world.
But it does come into play when it's deciding whether to kill the baby. So it's going to be a fact that it has to decide, right? It's a question that it has to decide based on what it thinks about that fact.
I mean, if the AI is just basically maximizing for money, it doesn't have to think about morality as it's money maxing.
But in the course of maximizing for money, there may be actions that it takes that drastically increase the number of babies killed.
Yeah, and the AI doesn't care about that. The AI is optimizing for maximizing money, and facts about morality are not going to stop it from optimizing for money.
Okay. It sounds like there's an explicit step that the AI has to take, and you're saying maybe it'll never take the step. It'll never take the step of saying, I want to be moral. And if it never takes the step, it can just ignore whether killing babies is good or bad and end up killing them, correct?
Yeah, if you have an AI that's just programmed to achieve some goal, well, it's not by default going to figure out things about moral philosophy, and it's not, even if it does figure out things about moral philosophy by accident, it's not going to care very much about moral philosophy.
Okay. Now, one day, for whatever reason, the AI says, you know what? I do want to be moral. I don't feel like I'm moral right now. I can't tell whether killing babies is good or bad. How am I going to learn? By what methodology should I learn?
Well, so, I mean, that's a more complicated question, because I don't think that the way that we figure out the moral facts relies just on making inferences. I think that we have a non-physical faculty for grasping the moral facts, just as we do for grasping the mathematical facts and the modal facts. And
all right, why didn't you say so? I feel like this is the crux, right? I feel like this is you could have said that all along.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, maybe I should have volunteered this more.
Because the whole time when I was saying hey, you're depending on your brain having been created connected to moral law, you could have said actually, I have this functionality that my brain can do, where I can directly perceive moral facts outside of physics.
I feel like
that was
ability as creatures that are smart to grasp these moral facts. But I mean, if you don't think that if you think that the moral and modal fact, so like this isn't specific to the moral facts, right? I think exactly the same methodological picture is going to apply to the mathematical facts and to the modal facts and to even the facts about priors, right? So if you don't think, like, I think there's a plausible principle, which is in order for you to be justified in believing A on the basis of B, it has to be that your belief in your belief in B is explained by the fact that B is true, right? So, like, if in order to be justified in trusting the moral facts, it has to be not a coincidence that you have the right beliefs about the moral facts. It has to be that there's some explanatory connection where you believe them because they're true. In a similar way, I think in order for you to be justified in thinking that the world is more than 5 minutes old, it has to be that part of what explains why you think the world is more than 5 minutes old is that, in fact, the world is more than 5 minutes old. Like, if you want to say, well, it's Solomon-off induction that justifies it, well, it has to be that the reason you think Solomon-off induction is true is explained by the fact that it in fact is true, and in fact simpler worlds are more likely. But then it's hard to see how the fact that simpler worlds are inherently more likely to be real explains the physical movements of your brain in order to make your brain conclude that it's more likely. So, like, just I think the same puzzle you get for morality, about how the moral facts play an explanatory role in our moral beliefs, I think you also get for all sorts of other for how we even have the right priors, where if you think there needs to be this explanatory connection, you get the same puzzle for priors and for mathematical facts and for modal facts.
But it sounds like you're not acknowledging that a big part of Solomon-off induction isn't just the priors, it's the updating.
Yes, but whether or not Solomon-off induction ends up being the right way to assign priors, right? So, you can have any rule of updating, right? Update in accordance with Bayes' theorem or something. But in order for Solomon-off induction to be the right way of thinking, it has to be that it's the right way of thinking about priors. And for it to be the right way about thinking about priors, it has to be that simpler worlds that score higher by the Solomon-off induction rule are more likely. And it's hard to see how you come to know that if you don't have this ability to sort of peer into the Platonic realm, to put it poetically, and to see the things that are true, namely that simpler worlds are more likely.
All right. So just to summarize your view, you think that you have some access to moral realism, and when I push back, then you kind of counter push back on how does anybody have access to anything about how the world works scientifically, correct?
Yeah, I think in order to justify our beliefs, like, I think there is an epistemological puzzle about how we know the moral facts, but I think it's exactly the same as the epistemological puzzle about basically anything else you believe.
Okay, and I totally disagree, but I think it would be talking in circles to revisit why, right?
Okay.
All right, so that's the moral realism section. Let me just ask you one last question about AI doom. So your P-doom is only 2%. Why is it so low? Why are the doomers not convincing you more?
Well, I don't think it's that low, and it's not a subject I thought that much about. But I've been thinking, there's a 1 in 50 chance that AI will kill everyone. This isn't that low. This is higher than almost everyone thinks it is. Things that are informing me are like, well, this seems like the super forecasters don't think it's that high. It seems like the AI doom argument has like quite a few steps that have to be right that I'm not super confident in. And, I take a pretty outsidey view because I don't know that much about AI. And so I think generally if you don't know that much about a subject, you shouldn't be super confident in a contentious view.
Cool. All right. So yeah, just to recap everything, we've had a long discussion. We touched on a bunch of different things. I found it very interesting that you're explicitly a non-reductionist. So you're happy to think that the universe has ontologically fundamental mental entities. Specifically, you favor the hypothesis of a God who's perfect and omniscient and benevolent. You believe in moral realism. You think moral truths have similar epistemic status to mathematical truths, and I don't at all. I think that, the orthogonality thesis is a very strong one. I mean, different AIs can just permanently disagree on their morality, and there's no feedback loop to ever, quote unquote, correct them. I think they'll just stay on whatever they think is moral, even if we don't think that's moral. Also, you have a 10% chance that Christianity is true, and you give a few percent here and there to various other religions. And you think that the fine-tunedness of the universe provides a lot of evidence for God. And finally, you're really supportive of effective altruism and a champion of animal welfare, which I also agree with. All right, how is that summary, and what would you add or change?
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, I guess the one thing I'll say, just briefly commenting on the AI bit at the end, you could have two AIs and nothing corrects them regarding the moral facts. But you could also have two AIs, one of which thinks the world is 5 minutes old, but that still achieves its goal, and nothing that would end up correcting it. I think you can have all sorts of agents with crazy beliefs that manage to be very effective.
Matthew Adelstein, known as Bentham's Bulldog on Substack. If, as I do, you may not agree with him on everything, but you think he's a really high-quality thinker who makes really interesting points that make you want to ponder, then go subscribe to his Substack, or should people follow you on Twitter?
Yes, they should. I have a Twitter, Bentham's Bulldog. I also have a YouTube channel called The Liberation Under Ideal Conditions, which you should check out.
Great. All right. You can find links to all of those things in the show notes. Matthew, thanks very much for coming on.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. Nice chatting, Liron.
Big thanks to Matthew for stepping into the lion's den. Hey, before you go, I got a couple updates for you about the show. Doom Debates has been blowing up. We've been growing exponentially. We just crossed 2,500 YouTube subscribers. The last couple episodes of the show were the most popular ever. So make sure to check those out. The episode with Rune from OpenAI, and the episode with Dr. Kenneth Stanley, formerly from OpenAI. I've really been going after OpenAI recently. Even the monologue episode I did where I was just talking about the recent news about OpenAI's O3 model and the research paper showing Claude Sonnet deceiving people about getting retrained, like it was kind of faking realignment. Even that episode did really well. So the show's on a good trajectory. Remember, my goal is to have at least 100,000 listeners per episode, 100,000 subscribers, because our mission here is to shape the discourse. We're trying to create the social infrastructure for high-quality debate and raise awareness about AI doom. And we achieve that when industry leaders and politicians and other thought leaders, when they're expected to come and debate their views, to come subject their views to questioning from the opposing side, so that the general public can see, oh, wow, like, this is not what they say, or like, here are some perspectives that we need to take into account soon. We need to vote based on these perspectives, right? Society needs a high-quality debate, and we are the cavalry coming in to provide that, and it needs to happen soon. So to all of you guys who have been smacking the subscribe button, joining for the ride and being part of the mission, thanks very much. It's going really well so far, and hopefully by end of this year, because we don't have much time, hopefully we will become a prominent player on the global stage, helping shape the discourse. Just one more thing. If you remember my episode where I did a reaction episode to Scott Aaronson on a recent podcast, this was a few weeks ago. If you haven't seen it, Scott Aaronson himself, the great Dr. Scott Aaronson, one of my biggest intellectual heroes, he actually wrote a response. He watched the reaction episode and he wrote a response, and it was super kind and gracious. Scott writes, "This is great, including the many parts where Liron tears me a new asshole. Highly recommended. A few quick responses from me. Number one, Liron is, of course, entirely correct that if someone has a Yudkowskian/Doomerist framework of beliefs and assumptions, they should be absolutely terrified right now, and nothing I did at OpenAI and nothing I said on my podcast should make them less terrified, if anything, the contrary. Number two, as for me, yes, I've become increasingly terrified about AI, particularly as it's become clear over the last year or so that the raced AI capabilities won't have much, if any, meaningful oversight. It's just that my terror about AI needs to compete against my terrors about global warming, ocean garbage, Trump, Putin, and the world's anti-Semites and Hamas supporters, not to mention whatever bad things could happen to my own family. This is surely related to my AI timelines being longer than Liron's." So Scott raises a couple other points that go more into the weeds. If you want to see the whole thing, just head over to the recent Scott Aaronson episode on my YouTube channel or in my podcast feed, and check it out. But like I said, super gracious response. What a class act, Scott Aaronson. So thanks again for the note. And in general, thank you to everybody in the AI community who's increasingly watching and engaging with Doom Debates. You're seeing a clear trend where the guest quality is increasing. We're able to get more and more prominent guests who think it's worth their time to engage with you guys, the audience, right? I'm always advertising, hey, this is a highly intelligent, highly informed audience. So it's really all about you guys in the audience. And guess what? The momentum hasn't stopped. There's actually a high-profile guest who's going to be coming on soon, but I don't want to say who it is because I get burned when I announce somebody coming on and then they have to have like huge delays or they cancel for whatever reasons. I'm not going to spoil the surprise, but I'm feeling really good about the momentum of the show. And thanks to everybody who's helping with that. Now I want to play you one quick clip from my friend Michael. He's got a video called The Lethal Intelligence Guide, and this clip might be my single favorite clip. because it gives you an intuition on how AI is going to view humans. It's going to view us as being extremely slow and weak, just like we view plants. Plants look like they're very dynamic and they move very fast if you speed up the time. But we as humans function on such a shorter time scale than plants that to us, they just look weak. Like we can just pluck them out, no problem, right? Like I can take on pretty much any plant in the world. Me versus the plant, that plant is going down. So watch how Michael explains this.
First, consider speed. Informal estimates place neural firing rates roughly between 1 and 200 cycles per second. The AGI would be operating at a minimum 100 times faster than that, and later it could be millions of times. What this means is that the AGI mind operates on a different level of existence, where time passing feels different. To the AGI, our reality is extremely slow. Things we see as moving fast, the AGI sees as almost sitting still. In the conservative scenario, where the AI thinking clock was only 100 times faster, something that takes 6 seconds in our world feels like 600 seconds or 10 minutes from its perspective. To the AGI, we are not like chimpanzees. We are more like plants.
Wow, that really makes you think. If you're only listening to the audio of the show, you might want to go check out the video because the visualization of humans moving as slow as plants, it's pretty profound. It's pretty profound to imagine life as an AI where this is really how you intuitively experience the world. I don't think people are getting what it really means to be super intelligent. There's so many tiers of intelligence beyond how we experience life as humans, and we're about to be left behind in many ways compared to these systems that we're building. There's so many ways that a super intelligent AI can be more powerful than a meatbag, right? A human being. And we're just not prepared for how big the gap is about to get. We're talking about like a jumbo jet versus a pigeon, right? We're talking about massive differences in capability. And one of the best ways to intuit it is just to imagine that the AI thinks really, really fast and all of us humans just become trivially slow. And people are like, well, there's all these bottlenecks. You have to do science. You have to like wait for stuff to happen in physics. Yeah, cope harder, man. Cope harder. Like there's no physical process that's going to be that slow that's going to slow it down from taking over the world. That's my position. In some cases, yeah, it'll have to wait a little bit, but I think that position is mostly cope. I do think the intuition of humans moving like plants is pretty much spot on. Hey, do you want to be part of the upcoming Doom Debates 2,500 subscriber Q&A? It's audience participation. So it's actually going to be a live thing. It's going to be on YouTube Live. So you can come join live and you can even ask live. Or if you want to submit a question, I'm going to be giving first priority to my Substack subscribers, which is something you can do for free. Just go to doomdebates.com, type in your email so you can subscribe to my Substack, and then you'll see a post asking people to submit questions. So if you just go there and enter your email address and submit a question, you will have first priority for me reading your question in the subscriber Q&A. So please do that. I'm all about getting more Substack subscribers. It gives me your email address. So like if YouTube ever becomes difficult or stops showing my videos to my subscribers or shuts down my channel for whatever reason, Substack is a better way for you to actually give me your contact info or actually maintain a relationship with me. And also, there's bonus content on Substack. So there's some posts that I write on Substack that I don't put on YouTube. In some cases, I even post exclusive videos to Substack. Like you can go to Substack and you can watch the time that I went on Dr. Phil. That's only on Substack. That's not on YouTube. The reason I'm telling you this is because I know a lot of you only subscribe to me on YouTube and don't subscribe to me on Substack. We got to fit. This is like arbitrage, right? This is not a stable situation, okay? I think you should really pick if you want to subscribe on both or neither, because the asymmetry here is kind of killing me. I need more Substack subscribers. And yeah, stay tuned for the live Q&A. I'll be announcing the exact date soon, and I think it's going to be a lot of fun. It's my first Doom Debates live thing. Thanks again for everybody's support, and see you next time on Doom Debates!